So this morning we're going to hit some fun things. Start off, I've decided after so many years of bad news, it seems like every year I came out, I could just see people cringing. They were saying, oh my God, what is he going to say is going wrong this year? So years ago, we decided to start handing out free money. So if you'd come out, so this year we have some free money for you. And Kristen, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I did not know I was going to be introduced as free money. I don't think that's ever happened before. But instead, it's free money by way of grants, which is really fun. So my name is Kristen Michaels. I'm actually the Children and Family Minister here at PVUMC. I've been here since 2019, and before being in vocational ministry, I'm also a pastor's kid. So I was, one of those wonderful unpaid volunteers from basically 6 months of age until I came here. So as many of you know who work at churches, you never wear just one hat. So I also took on, along with our preschool director, who is way too busy with preschoolers right now, applying for the security grant through the federal government this year.
So you can keep that microphone, have a seat. So can you tell us a little bit about the grant that you did get for your church? First of all, how much was it?
Oh, it's a reimbursable grant and we were awarded the full amount that we asked for, which was $150,000. So that's the max that you can request.
And what was the money to be used, or what was it used for that they then reimbursed you?
Right. So you have to go through and you have to be very specific in your application process and tell them what improvements you'd like to make. The plan with FEMA, who helps to fund this grant, is just preparedness, like nationwide preparedness, and helping to equip churches and other nonprofits for additional security upgrades. So for us, it was things like new security cameras, like better window film, different ballards, better wayfinding signage. We were just awarded it, so we haven't put all of those things in place yet. So there's just that whole process. So it's anything along those lines to help improve the infrastructure of the security of your nonprofit location.
And as I understand, this is federal money from FEMA, but it's actually awarded by the Arizona Department of Homeland Security.
All of the individual states have their own process. So since we're in Arizona, you would apply through the Arizona Department of Homeland Security. So it's just on their website. It's really easy. All the grants that they have available are there. So it's just azdohs.gov/grants.
I see by the last item on the slide that the deadline date was September 10th. So it looks like we're a little late for this year.
That was actually for the state one.
For the state,
yeah.
Okay.
So you can't be awarded in the same benefit year. You can't be awarded both the federal grant and the state grant. So there's the federal window in the time they'll give it, and then that closes so you find out if you're awarded it, and then the state one opens and you have 2 weeks to apply for the state one.
So it's basically too late for this cycle, but not too late to get started for next year's cycle.
And really, if you're thinking about doing it, I would say start now. The most important thing that you need for either grant is you have to do a security assessment, a threat vulnerability assessment. You can contact your local police department or Homeland Security, and they can give you resources for folks to come through and do that with you. If you've already started any grant process or some security improvements, you want to make sure you've completed those before you call them in, because it needs to be you have to have kind of the clean slate, this is what we have now, this is what we want. So don't make any improvements within that time, or else you need to do a new vulnerability assessment.
Yeah, the good news is it's free money. The bad news is it's from the government, right? So there's going to be some bureaucratic nitpicking involved, but if you're willing to go through the brain damage, the money's there.
Yes.
So, Kristen, thank you so much.
Yes. And I will give you all the heads up for the federal grant program. It almost always lines up with Holy Week and Easter. So try to get a head start on it. Go to the seminars, but what's important is that vulnerability threat assessment, and then get in your mind what you'd like to do. And you don't have to get formal quotes, but reach out to a few vendors and get an idea about what things cost. Because when you apply, they don't want you to have full quotes yet, but you do have to be very specific. If you're going to change all the locks on your doors. They need to know exactly how many doors and what kind of locks and how much you think it's going to cost. So
Oh, great. Thank
the
you.
more information you have, the better, but the application process is actually really easy. It's like an Excel document and a couple short paragraph answer essays.
So unfortunately, you're in charge of how many kids today?
We have preschool chapel.
So she's got to go run preschool chapel. So unfortunately, she will not be able to stay around this morning. However, if you have follow-up questions, you can direct those through Monica, and she will help you follow up with details and so
For
forth.
sure, yes.
So we'd like to bring on our next speaker, who is Lacey Cooper, who will be coming on. Lacey is an attorney with our firm, a former county attorney as well as U.S. attorney. Have I got that right? Or was it Arizona Attorney General?
No, that's right. Yeah.
U.S. Attorney. And I thought the sequence of the events was rather interesting. We were just talking about security upgrades, right? So why would you ever worry about security in your friendly little campus? So can you tell us about this little episode that's up on the screen here, Lacey?
Well, Bob, let me pose a hypothetical for
Okay,
you. It's
perfect.
Thursday at 4:30. You're packing up your things. You're getting your lunchbox in your car, and you're thinking, it's time for me to head out. I got a couple of days until Sunday morning. And your social media star, up-and-comer, 19-year-old, comes running into the office and says, I just saw something online. There's going to be a protest at our church on Sunday morning to free Palestine. It's not a hypothetical. That happened to a church here in town this year.
And by the way, let me say, for the record, that we do not take a position on whether you should free Palestine or not free Palestine. The point is, if you didn't invite a protest of some type to your campus, you may not be prepared to deal with it appropriately. So please, this is not an anti-Palestinian thing. Don't send me emails about Palestine, but just go with me as an example of an unplanned, unhappy event. And so what happened that made this unhappy?
So, and this is a real screenshot of what they saw online, where their church is being called racist white bigots, and they actually haven't done anything to invite this. But this protester decided that this church was close by, it's easy to walk to, so I'll just bring my flag and start a protest. And the result was that online, the social media backlash was building up, and people were getting behind this guy, and the church started to panic a little bit because they were seeing all this bad press about them in the social media. And the protester came and led a protest on their campus. So we walked them through, what do you do? And we put in your packet a handout to give you some kind of practical tips too about what to do, although we encourage you to call us if anything like this comes up. But you're gonna do a threat assessment. Hey, is this real? Is this something that we need to actually worry about? Is this a physical safety issue? Is it a property damage issue? Or is it sort of just a reputation of the church issue? And if it's just a reputational harm issue, what's the scope of the harm? Do we need to have any response to it? If so, who should we respond to? Is there an audience within our congregation that needs to know this information? Is it just our staff? Is it actually all of our congregants? Is it just our members? And you're going to kind of do an evaluation about who needs to know. And then the third question is press going to find out what's going on here? Do we need to have a media response ready to go? And so we've kind of walked through some of those things with you in the packet, but feel free to call us. Let me give you another hypothetical, Bob, which unfortunately happens more often on our church campuses and with our nonprofit clients than we would like to have happen. But a teacher who's accused of an allegation of misconduct with a student. What do you do? How do you respond? We had to work through with one of our clients, how do you respond in that situation? And at the end of the day, we decided that we needed to send some notification to parents. And so we drafted a response that would help to notify parents of what was going on. And we also ended up doing a press release, and we helped draft a press release that would be appropriate for what was going on. And here's a sample of that press release, but essentially we're just given the bare facts that somebody was accused of misconduct. Keep walking through that.
Yeah, and let me just throw a couple of random thoughts for you. The first one is, when we are trying to decide our topics for these seminars every year, we kind of go back through like what's happened over the last year since we were together. And we've had a lot of these calls that are quasi-media events, quasi-internal problems, quasi-real problems. Some of them are real problems with a real potential for a serial predator. And so you guys are now being thrust into roles that you probably weren't really trained for, of trying to sort out what kind of problem you're dealing with, how you deal with the media, how you deal with social media, which social media you use, so on and so forth. So this is real life material that we're bringing forward to you now, and these press releases are fraught with unnecessary damage to your church if you do them incorrectly. So if I could leave you with one takeaway, don't repeat the charge, and never voluntarily put out a press release or a social media post that creates a negative reaction. I mean, why would you voluntarily publish negative material about yourself? It just makes no sense. So the trick, if you will, or the technique, is to take the situation and find the good in it, find the positive, and emphasize that while being transparent. And there is a little bit of art, and it takes some practice. And if you look carefully at the language that Lacey crafted here, you'll see that this language should not be creating an emotional response that's negative for you. And for example, this paragraph, the well-being of students is our top priority. Therefore, we request that the privacy of students and families be respected, especially those who have been most affected by these events. That message is worth repeating, right? And it's certainly not like we just had a terrible event and we're sorry and we really wish it hadn't happened, and if we find the people, we'll hang them. Whatever, but the point, you kind of see where we're going with it.
We also have to be super careful in what we say publicly so that we don't walk ourselves into some defamation claim with the individual who's being accused, or even with maybe the victim or any other individuals that are involved. And so we are very careful to only recite facts that we can support, for instance, from a police report. And we want to send the message, hey, we're fully cooperating with law enforcement on this thing. And by the way, law enforcement has a timeline for doing their investigation, and we're not going to get in the way of that. So we're not handing out a bunch of extra details right now. We're just going to give the bare minimum information that we have to for, in this case, the press, but even when we're communicating with parents, because we can't trample on the law enforcement investigation.
Well, and you'll notice the first sentence in this part of the press release says, upon hearing of the allegation. Remember, a person under our legal system is not guilty until a court rules them guilty, and it's just possible that the police got this wrong. So just because this high school teacher was arrested doesn't mean they did it. B, it doesn't mean that they'll be found guilty of it even if they did it. So you have a real tightrope to walk here. So we really don't want to do a press release unless you absolutely have to. Could you meet with parents? Sure. Narrow the focus. In other words, shoot with a rifle, not a shotgun. Could you meet with just the teachers or just the staff instead of sending out a post on Facebook to half the known world? So really think about limiting the exposure on these things and being neutral. So Lacey, I loved your last paragraph here. If you might read that to them.
We would like to express gratitude and appreciations for the diligence and professionalism displayed by the detectives at the Glendale Police Department during the course of its investigation. Just positive, friendly, happy.
Support your local police. I mean, they got a tough job here trying to figure this out on often incomplete and confusing facts. So we really do want to support their efforts. So here's some your short tips. Lacey, give us your quick takeaways.
So that was pretty much the extent of the press release. It was short. We weren't really justifying anybody's conduct. We weren't trying to explain. We weren't defending. We weren't accusing, right? We're just giving the basic information that there was an allegation. We're not repeating the details, the sensitive or gruesome details about what occurred. We just
allegedly occurred.
Right. We're not using the school's name repeatedly on our, this school's campus. This allegation happened, and we're not saying that it happened on the school's campus, but the school is really, appreciative of what the detectives did.
In fact, if you look at that press release, the name only appears once. Every time thereafter throughout the press release, it's us, we, them, the administration, whatever. But we don't want to repeat the name because the studies have found that people who listen to the news remember something like 12% of it. And the happiest thing that can happen for your reputation is that this hits the news cycle once, 12% of the people who saw it remember it, and the next night there's a hurricane. And so it doesn't continue to damage it. The worst thing you can do is trot out some person who doesn't sell very well, dare I use the word, might even be combative or obnoxious, and argues with the reporters, giving them a whole new news cycle or two to repeat.
Yeah, and the next day, if they forget exactly what that church's name was because they only heard it the one time, or they, misremember, that's okay.
Well, there are 6 Hope Baptist churches in the valley. It might be the other 5, right?
I guess we don't want one of our other clients to be
I meant to say Faith.
And as Bob said, you want them to leave with a positive feeling. So we do a lot of things like, what went right here? What kind of steps did you put in place in advance to make sure that this could be caught, that bad things didn't happen, that worse things didn't happen? What kind of policies did you have in place? What kind of surveillance, have you put in place? Did you get that FEMA grant and you put new locks on the door? These are all the positive things we did to keep our kids safe, in particular in a child abuse allegation situation. And then this is why that worked. We discovered the issue and we reported to law enforcement. That's all positive, right? Now we're going to let law enforcement do what they're going to do. And just as a plug, in my prosecutorial career, I was a child abuse prosecutor. I prosecuted a lot of sexual predators for child physical and sexual abuse allegations. So one of the things that I do for our clients is I help you to craft your policies to ensure that children are protected. I come in and give trainings about what does it look like for somebody to try to engage in grooming of your children. How do you detect that, identify it, stop child abuse before it starts? So if you're interested in any of those services that we provide to either help you with your policies or to train your staff and volunteers or anybody who has contact with kids, happy to do that, as well as to help with this crisis kind of stuff.
And the training part is really key because you may recall from our prior discussions that your church as an organization is only liable if it's found to be negligent. Negligence is conduct which falls below the standard of care for churches in your community. So if you have a robust training program and you have records that can document your procedures have followed it, even though an event occurred, a jury may very likely find that you were not negligent and therefore not be liable for the damages. So you are not liable for every bad thing that happens on your campus. You are liable for being negligent about how you prepare for and respond to events of this type. Lacey, thank you very much. I apologize. We tried to cram 3 elements of this problem in, so if we could bring out Chris Taylor. Yes. Thank you, Lacey.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you for coming today. So you might have guessed there was a hidden theme behind this. The first was free money. The second one was what happens after something goes wrong. And the third theme here now is, should you be thinking about your safety and security team? If you don't have one, should you be thinking about having one? If you have one, what should you be thinking about doing to meet that standard of care in the community of having proper policies and procedures and training, right? Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Absolutely. So the Arizona Church Security Network was formed in 2017. My background was in the criminal justice system, and then I moved into education and ministry. I served in full-time ministry as a pastor at Christ Community Church in Tucson for about 15 years. And during that time, one of the ministries that I oversaw was our safety and security ministry.
And you have an undergraduate degree from?
I have an undergraduate in criminal justice administration, and then one of my graduate degrees is an MDiv.
And that was from?
And that was from Liberty
Yeah.
University.
So he's one of us.
Yes, absolutely.
So the goal of this church security network is to do what?
So our goal is really a three-pronged approach. We want to make sure that your policies and procedures reflect best practices, so we work with various insurance companies and attorneys to ensure that. We look at training as well, and we provide training in about 65 different areas. So we do everything from how do we respond to medical emergencies and various things of that nature, all the way up to active violence and advanced firearms training and things of that nature.
Let's do a little pop quiz. Just by show of hands, how many of you have either taken or know that your church staff has taken a Stop the Bleed class? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We got here just in time. This is really important. If you have a serious accident, especially if you have a shooting on your campus, most gunshot victims die from loss of blood. And there are a series of very easy to learn, cheap, efficient methods that can be taught to your security staff and even your other staff to be able to deal with that situation. If you haven't done Stop the Bleed, I can't say this on the public record, but let's see, how does Donald Trump say that? There's somebody who says you would be negligent if you don't have Stop the Bleed classes for your team. So talk about this Palestinian event we saw for a minute. How would, pick one or two of the classes that you guys teach, how would that have helped that church deal with that situation?
So there are a few classes there that we would look at. One of our most popular is just a situational awareness. How do we find out that was on social media in the first place so that we're not surprised when we show up to our worship service and there's a large number of protesters? In addition, we have a course where we talk about how do we interact with protesters, how do we interact with First Amendment auditors, because what they're looking for is our specific reactions. And our goal is to deny them those reactions and yet make sure we are keeping our congregations absolutely safe from any potential spillover threats that may come as a result of that protest.
Is that called verbal de-escalation?
That is. We do a wide variety of our verbal de-escalation courses. We start out with one for our congregations that's 2 hours long, and we go all the way up into courses where we spend a lot of time role-playing with you. So not only do we give you, these are the verbal techniques we think would be effective in this situation, now we will put you in a role play where you can practice with a safe environment and role players that are trained and know what this could look like in the real world. So you're not caught off guard the first time you're experiencing it.
And I might make a point here that I find to be a common misconception among some of our clients who come in. If you say to them, do you have a safety team or a security team, it seems like people's minds run automatically to they want to have armed ushers. Well, I'm not saying it's a bad idea to have armed ushers necessarily. On the other hand, 99%, literally, of the things which your security team does not involve a firearm, a baton, an edged weapon, or a jiu-jitsu hold. But it involves a lot of this verbal de-escalation. It involves medical training. It's being there if somebody slips and falls. It's being able to spot a suspicious package where somebody might, we've actually had situations at some of our local churches where we really believe that this guy was testing our reactions. He came in on a motorcycle, dropped a black backpack off, and left. And the question was, what's that all about? I mean, because if you've been in an airport in the last 20 years, an unattended backpack can easily be a bomb. So,
and just recently, we had at a church in Tucson, a Beanie Baby found that within its collar, it had a little plastic heart, And there were 5 blue pills that the sheriff's department tested and came back as fentanyl. And that was left outside the children's ministry building just prior to service. And so we look at what does that look like in the environment that we're in. So many times people look at that active violence, but as Bob said, that's really not what we're looking at. We're looking at overall awareness, how to solve various problems that may come up. And most often it's going to be verbally, but we're seeing additional threats. I never would have thought of a Beanie Baby with fentanyl pills in the collar. And that was just a few weeks ago.
And really the point here is we're not trying to turn you into an armed fortress with a metal detector at the front gate, although that's not a bad idea. But really the idea is to create what I would really like to call a hospitality team. I mean, if you have good security people, they are trained to reflect Christ to the congregation, to strangers who come in, and even a homeless person, for example, who might wander onto your parking lot and try to set up camp. So we're not trying to have the Gestapo come in and throw these guys out, but we're trying to create an awareness at your level, because it's the business people, it's you in this room who set the tone for protecting the flock, and then for taking the appropriate steps to be able to respond in ways that aren't negligent and ways that do reflect Christ in what we do. But to simply stick your head in the sand and say, it could never happen to us. Come spend a week with me or a month in my office and just watch what comes through, and you'll pretty quickly decide that the head in the sand deal is probably not the way to go. So, Chris, if somebody wants to follow up, wants to learn more about your classes, so on and so forth, you'll be back by the Church in Ministry Law sign?
I absolutely will be, and I'll be available there, and you can always reach out to us with any questions that you have. One thing I didn't say that I want to make sure you realize is what sets us apart is everything we do is from a biblical worldview. So we're setting up safety and security ministries, not just safety and security teams, and there's a huge difference there.
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much for coming up.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, Jonathan Rublin, will be now coming with some actual substantive legal update on current legal and legislative issues for church and ministries. John has spoken here before, but just for fun, it would probably be good to have John tell us a little bit about his background, which also includes, John, is it an MDiv?
Yeah, I have a THM from Dallas Seminary. Is that what you want? Yeah, well, just picture this. The first, she's moving that out. First 12 and a half years of married life, I was in school full time. So picture that.
Yeah, let's get you set, John.
Yeah, this place comes with your own personal roadies. The best. Tipper. Yes, thanks, Bob. Good to be with you all again this year. So I just want to go through, you should have an outline in your packet from Church and Ministry Law, where I've got my topics. It should be in a white folder. If somebody doesn't have the white folder, please raise your hand, and Cody will get you one. And just understand that as you look at my slides, you will see that I violate the rules about how much you put on your slides, and that's because I'm going to send them to you if you want them. So you can email me, or we can create a list in the back. I didn't get it to Monica soon enough, and we'll email those to you. So we have a lot of detail on this slide for you. So keep your hands up. Cody's, I know he can move faster than that. But, so Cody is a recent hire. Just graduated from Creighton Law School, and he's joined us as an associate doing church and ministry law. So glad to have him with us today. So I'm going to go through a number of topics in this list and kind of highlight those. These are kind of current legal legislative issues that are important for churches and ministries. The first one is in the last year, almost 2 years, there were several cases where it involved a school, a private school, and the private school, there were incidents happened that involved assertions of misconduct on a sexual nature, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, and the facts were pretty bad in the cases, and so the judges were really looking for a way to hold the school accountable. And so, as you know, Title IX has enhanced both procedures and requirements around, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination. And so, but Title IX requires that your school, your organization, takes federal funds. And these private Christian schools did not take federal funds. And so the judge in these cases, two primary cases, the judges decided that tax-exempt status was qualified as receiving federal financial assistance. And so they held the schools liable to comply with Title IX and address these situations in these cases. So these cases went on for 2 years. One of them was appealed. In the meantime, there was a piece of legislation introduced in the House, in Congress, to make it clear that tax-exempt status does not qualify as federal financial assistance. In the meantime, the one case in Maryland was appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Fourth Circuit had a really stellar oral argument and court decision making it clear, at least as to the Fourth Circuit, that the tax-exempt status does not qualify as federal financial assistance. Now, before these two cases, tax-exempt status had never been determined as qualifying as federal, receiving basically federal funds. And so most other jurisdictions don't have those cases, and there's a push to continue to get this law passed, even though the case has been resolved. So as you what you read in this slide, and this is actually language from the statute, is that the law is going to say that there is tax-exempt status can never be perceived or understood, misunderstood as qualifying as federal assistance, financial assistance. But I think that it's incumbent on us to not only recognize that, but also it's important the way we talk about tax-exempt status. Tax-exempt status is not something the government gives us. It's not assistance from the government. It's not the government's money. What it is that tax-exempt status was granted for a couple reasons. But one is that the Congress recognized the value that religious organizations play in our culture, organization, society. And they wanted to set that apart and encourage that. Secondly, when it comes to religious organizations, that there is some separation with the First Amendment that occurs because it's free exercise of religion and the government is not entangling with dollars what the religious organization is doing. So our tax-exempt status is the government recognizing and affirming who we are and the role we play, not giving us something. And it's important that we talk about it in that way. The second topic I want to talk about is this importance of reviewing your corporate documents. And as you know, your tax-exempt status, 501c3 tax-exempt status, is based on a two-part test that the IRS applies. First part is organizational test. The second part is the operational test. Is your nonprofit corporation organized as a 501c3? And to do that, the IRS looks at your governing documents, your articles of incorporation primarily, to see that you have language in there that's required by 501c3. It says no political activity, no private inurement, you're exclusively operated for tax-exempt purposes. You have stated charitable, religious, educational, tax-exempt purposes. And you must have that in your corporate documents when you're applying to the IRS and to maintain that qualification as an organization. And so I just want to encourage you to have your church pull out their articles of incorporation and bylaws and make sure that that the bylaws have been reviewed or updated in the last 5 years, updated in the last 10 years. And secondly, that your articles of incorporation have requisite 501c3 language. We're increasingly, and Monica has mentioned this, increasingly coming across organizations where they don't have that. And when the IRS, if the IRS were ever to review that, or even a state attorney general review, charity official review, you want to be able to comply. But in addition to that, you want to make sure that your website is consistent with your missions, a statement, that your articles of incorporation are still state or are describing the kind of organization you are. Every year I have organizations that have been, I was working with a Presbyterian home for children, orphans and children and families in North Carolina. It's been in existence for over 100 years. They've been taking all kinds of religious organization exemptions, and there is nothing in their articles or bylaws that says they're a religious organization. So you just want to make sure that that's in place. So the other thing is that your church changes its name. Well, you want to have the authority to conduct business under that name, to open a bank account under that name. Then you want to file a trade name registration with the Arizona Secretary of State and maintain that. So. The third topic is I'm going to go through a series of tax exemptions that aren't income tax. So we'll look at property tax, an employment tax, and then there is an income tax case where there's trending. There's two trends that are going on, just so you understand. One trend is that the IRS's enforcement of tax-exempt organizations is decreasing for two reasons. One is money. Two is political reasons. Like they do not want to get entangled in, for example, addressing a church having a political candidate in their pulpit. Like they're just ignoring those because they don't want the political landmine that comes with that. And that goes all the way back to, many of you recall the Tea Party cases of 2013, 2014. Actually, it started in 2012 with Lois Lerner and how that blew up in the IRS's face. And so the IRS is decreasing enforcement, which is a good or bad thing, depending on where you're at, right? And what's increasing is state enforcement of charitable laws and consumer protection laws. And states are increasingly reducing the scope of organizations that qualify for certain tax exemptions, mostly driven by a money factor, right? There is maybe a philosophical, I don't know about anti-religious bent, but at least there's a piece of that as well. But it's primarily a money factor. In fact, I'll just share this one. I think that clock is right? So I represent a number of organizations. Actually, these are camps and conference centers, some of them in Wisconsin, just for the interesting note. And Wisconsin provides a property tax exemption for up to 40 acres for a Bible camp. Okay? Now you say, okay, what's a Bible camp? There's no place in the Wisconsin statutes. There's no case law that defines a Bible camp. So, as you can imagine, a Bible camp that started in 1940 was doing what? Right? You were in tents, you had a campfire, you had, right, all that. You dealt with the elements. Now you go to a Bible camp and it is like a hotel, right? Like it's a retreat. We're there to relax. It's like casual. Some of it's pretty fine dining, right? And so the the tax assessor for this county was like, you're not a Bible camp. And I'm like, okay, well, what legal definition are you using for Bible camp? Refused to provide one. And so I found a Supreme Court case where it was actually an unemployment tax issue, but it involved a conference center, and so the Supreme Court defines what this conference center is doing, and it's like retreats, adult groups, all that kind of stuff, and says that it qualified. It wasn't the ruling, but it qualified for the property tax exemption. She wouldn't accept that. And finally, she admitted she had no definition, that this was probably ripe for litigation, but she was going to restore their tax exemption for this year. Okay? Well, I just wanted you to know that there's an organization called the National Association of Attorney Generals. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was in their full day session that they do with people who practice in this area of the law. And the National Association of Attorney Generals, they go to these conferences and they share their approach. So there is just so you understand, there's a nationwide Association of Attorney Generals who are saying, look, like we're limiting, like we're really looking hard, and state charity officials were really looking hard at local organizations, different tax exemptions, because we've been asked to, right? So the first case that I want to talk a little bit about, and I wanted to use it for a couple lessons, is a church in Detroit, Michigan called Woodside Bible Church. Woodside Bible Church decided they would buy a retreat house on Lake Huron. They buy this retreat house. When they applied for property tax exemption, when they first purchased it, they described how they were going to use it for ministry, how there was going to be teaching, how there was going to be marriage enrichment seminars and workshops, all this, right? It's a 12-bedroom home on Lake Huron. Well, they had property tax exemption from 2017 to 2020. In 2021, the local tax assessor told them, we understand that you're having weddings there, and so I changed it from your exemption under a church organization to residential. And the church said, we don't do weddings there. We've never done weddings there. Okay, well, give us evidence of your religious activity there. Okay? Well, this church had no records. They had no evidence. They had no documentation that there were, like they hadn't recorded any of the activities they had done at this church, at this house. So they lost their property tax exemption because they couldn't evidence that they were using it for church religious ministry activity. Right? So there are a couple lessons there. One is, obviously, if you're going to use it and say you're going to use it for a purpose, you want to document that activity and as to how you use it, right? Secondly, which is a really important lesson, is that rumors can kill you, right? Like, rather than having historically there's been this kind of mindset, like, let's just stay, it's very libertarian, kind of like just leave us alone. We're not going to engage with local authorities. We're just doing our own thing, and we're a church. Whatever we do is a church, right? Well, that actually can work against you because there's a fear of the unknown, and there is unknown when it comes to local officials sometimes about who you are and what you're doing at your particular location. And you're better off inviting, right, your local councilman, councilperson, right? You're better off inviting them to activities, better off sending a letter to them about the things that you've done as a church or ministry over the years. Like, I just encourage you to get out of a libertarian mindset and into an engaging with meaningful stuff about the church and impact you're having on your community, right? I think that's an important lesson from here. This quote on this slide is very, becoming more typical of charity officials. Petitioner's apparent position is that everything it does furthers its mission, and this must be considered either religious services or the teaching of its religious beliefs. Right? So here's the third lesson. Right? Your church is your mindset that whatever we do, right, is covered by our religious organization, exemption, and protected activity. Right? Well, whatever you do is obviously motivated by your faith, motivated by outreach, right? I just encourage you to be clear about documenting that, right? Why do you have a coffee shop, right? Why do you go and do this activity? Why do you have this celebration, right? And ground it in a biblical basis, religious purpose around that, right? So very interesting lessons from this Woodside Bible Church. The second case is a case in Wisconsin. It had to do with unemployment tax. Now, as you're aware, like churches exemption from unemployment tax. Well, Catholic charity bureaus had an unemployment tax exemption because they were a church-related kind of activity. They are a separate nonprofit organization, but Catholic Charity Bureaus was denied its unemployment tax exemption by the state of Wisconsin. And the state of Wisconsin applied a test to determine whether it was a religious, whether it qualified as a religious church organization by whether they had, their activities were, and I'm going to use air quotes, I apologize, typical religious activities. That's Wisconsin's standard. In fact, there's 4 states with that standard. Okay? Are their activities typical religious activities? Well, Wisconsin said no as to Catholic Charities because they are dealing with donated clothing. They employ people who do not have to agree with their statement of faith, right? They're trying to serve people in a community, provide resources. These are not typical religious activities. Now, all of us would say, well, yeah, there's a biblical basis for what they're doing, right? But that's Wisconsin's position. There are other states who their standard for determining unemployment, and I believe this is Arizona's, is the sincerity of the person's religious beliefs is a primary factor. Okay? So we have these 2 approaches under different state laws, right? And in this case, Arizona wasn't part of the case, but the appeal had included 4 different states on both sides. There's actually an expectation that this case is going to go to the Supreme Court to decide what is the standard for determining what is church religious type of activities. Okay? So that brings us to our next case, right? And that is, it's like becoming a question for state regulators and the IRS, what is a church? Right? That's where we're headed, is what is a church? Now, as many of you know, right, the IRS has historically operated under what is called kind of a 14-point analysis, right? This IRS 14-point analysis asks, does a church have a seminary of its own? So it's very denomination-centric, oriented, I should say. And so the question is, what is a church? Now, this case it involves the IRS. It's God's Storehouse Topeka Church versus the United States. And the most recent part of this has been the IRS initiated a church audit. Now, as many of you know, there's a law called the Church Audit Procedures Act. And it actually makes it more difficult to audit a church than other nonprofit organizations. Contrary to popular thinking, it's actually harder to audit a church. you have to get sign off of a high-ranking treasury official, which is undefined, to audit a church. Well, they initiated this audit and they asked for bank records. God's Storehouse opposed it based on the Church Audit Procedures Act. Right? They had the director of exempt organizations had signed off on it, and the court ruled against the church. The church doesn't have regular worship services. They meet, occasional Bible study. They are handing out, they're doing food for hungry. They're doing clothing. They're trying to meet needs in the community. All things that we see a church should be doing. But their lack of formality, the IRS is saying, you're not a church. Right? So I think this case is going to continue to proceed. I don't think it'll go all the way to the Supreme Court, but I think it will eventually get to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals and start this process of defining what is a church. So that lends us to continue to say, what is the church's basis and motivation, biblical doctrine, religious purposes behind the scope of activities you're doing, right? Because you increasingly see that as people from the outside look in, they're not seeing what they think in their head is a church. And as our culture continues to move away from, right, like we no longer read the Bible in school, right, continues to move away from people having a basis for a religious understanding or what the Bible is about, they're going to continue to narrow their definition of what a church is, right, and perceive some of the things that you do as non-church associated, right? So my encouragement is look at what you're doing and make sure there's a solid philosophical basis for what it's doing that's documented, right? By philosophical, I mean like your biblical purposes, right? All right, so those are some tax exemption cases that are just kind of helping you to understand kind of a trend that's happening. I wanted to take a little time because how can you, like every minute of every day is filled with politics, right? So I just wanted to touch on the political and legislative limitations for 501c3 organizations, including churches. Understand that political activity is defined as support or opposition of a candidate for office. That's political activity. Legislation is support or opposition for legislation, pending legislation. Right? So lobbying a 501c3, a church, an organization, can do a quote-unquote insubstantial amount of lobbying. And in 501c3 parlance language, that's primarily understood as around 15% or less. Insubstantial is basically 15% or less. It's defined in the UBIT rules as that. So that's measured by money and activity, including volunteers. You can make an election. I think Monica's probably talked about this. You can do an election, 501h election, to measure it just by money that's spent on support or opposition of legislation. Political activity is absolutely prohibited in the statute, that you cannot support or oppose a candidate for office. But that doesn't mean that you can't, you know, many of you receive or maybe you produce, you know, values voting type of thing, or where candidates take positions on certain things that are important to our faith. Interestingly enough, the IRS just released a recent announcement that made it clear that a church can rent its facility to a political candidate or a political party to use. Okay? However, you have to charge them your normal rates, right? You have to make it open to any candidate, and you can't refuse a candidate. Okay? So Your church building can be used for some kind of political activity. The church can't be involved. You can rent out your facility, though. And so that's kind of the IRS's latest kind of take on that. Let me touch on Charitable Giving Act legislation. So now that you know you can be involved in some lobbying legislative activity, insubstantial, no more than 50% of your time, resources, funds, then let me give you a few pieces of legislation that might be helpful for you to look at. Charitable Giving Act legislation is, if it passed, it's a law that would provide people who take the standard deduction to still be able to deduct some of their charitable giving. In fact, the current act would say that you could deduct up to a third of the standard deduction, which is, I forget the exact number, somewhere around 24,000, something like that. So this would allow people who give to the church who may not be able to take their deduction under standard rules because you've taken the standard deduction, right, would still be able to deduct those contributions from your taxes up to $8,000 or so, right? So what happened was in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the standard deduction was significantly raised, right? Grateful for that. It helped a lot of people. But at the same time, what it did was it made it so less people are able to deduct their charitable contributions to a tune of, depending on what study you look at, between $13.1 billion and $27 billion that's impact giving to charitable organizations. So this Charitable Giving Act legislation, there's a Senate bill and a House bill would allow individuals and people who file their taxes to be able to still deduct. This is what happened during the COVID. The CARES Act provided for the $300 deduction for an individual and a $600 for married filing jointly. This would actually expand that. So contact your congressman about that. Right? Call your congressperson and tell them you support this and ask them to support it. Right? The Clergy Act is an opportunity to opt back into Social Security. There's been a few changes in this, but most clergy, as you're aware, can opt out of Social Security withholding and participation in the program. That's actually irreversible, although the law was also amended to say that if you could show that it was purely for economic reasons, then you can actually get that reversed, right? But this would allow clergy to take the opportunity to opt back into the Social Security system, because unfortunately, clergy often think, okay, if I'm out of Social Security, I'm getting that money, I'm going to put it into an IRA, okay? So we get this far, and this isn't happening, right? So we end up with a number of clergy in very tough positions when they go to transition out of full-time ministry. So this is one that I would encourage you to contact your congressperson if it's of interest to your church. Here's another one, Foreign Grant Reporting Act. And this is a law that would change the requirements on the 990 to where you would need to report detail around funds that are going overseas to missionaries, mission organizations, people working in other countries. And the argument is that they're trying to get to limit the amount of money that's sent away to like Hamas, right? But actually what the downside and why I'm kind of against this is that you have missionaries and missions in closed access nations that if they're discovered through a public 990 that they're getting money from a religious organization, that they could risk their presence, they could risk their lives, right? A lot of things. So my hope is that this doesn't go anywhere. There's actually a schedule that is on the 990 that was negotiated a number of years ago, actually I think it was around 2007, that allowed some reporting but didn't require details as a name, address, amount, purpose, that kind of thing in those grants. So we're hoping that this one gets overturned. So I would encourage you to contact your congressperson for the church to say you don't support this, there are not only religious foreign workers, but there are other types of foreign workers that may be put at risk. This case, I want to tell you, is probably the greatest religious freedom case ever decided. Right? So we're used to saying, looking at religious freedom cases and saying, they're taking away our freedoms, we're going to lose all kinds of things. This Supreme Court case, a little over a year ago, Groff versus DeJoy, is the best free exercise of religion case to be decided in my lifetime, right? So that makes you want to know, how old is he? So this case involved a U.S. Postal Service worker who said, I can't work on Sunday, and the Postal Service is like, awesome, we're not open on Sunday, right? Okay. And then Postal Service did a contract with Amazon. And Amazon told the Postal Service, okay, you're delivering on Sunday. And this guy said, I can't work Sunday. I don't work Sunday. And so the Postal Service said, yeah, you are, or are you losing your job? And so when it comes to religious freedom in the workplace, the court requires, the law requires that the employer must make a religious accommodation. That the employer must make a religious accommodation unless it would cause the employer undue hardship. And so since 1977, the Supreme Court case that governed what an undue hardship was is this case, TWA versus Hardison. And in TWA versus Hardison, undue hardship is just a de minimis cost. If it costs the employer anything, then that's enough to deny the religious accommodation and say, no, you're working on Sunday. And so it could be, well, we've got disgruntled employees, or we have to pay somebody else overtime. Okay, we're denying your religious accommodation. You have to work Sunday. So in Groff versus DeJoy, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that an undue hardship defense to provide a religious accommodation requires showing that the burden of granting an accommodation would result in substantial increased cost in relation to the business. So it changed it from de minimis, anything can do it, to like, now an employer has to show substantial increased cost to its business because it provided this religious accommodation. Okay? So yes, he can say, I'm not working on Sunday. Now, you're like, how does this apply to us? Well, think about the people in your congregation, or some of you or some of your relatives who say, well, I'm not going to involve myself in that DEI training because it's contrary to my faith. Or this one, a current case, a school worker terminated because they're like, no, I believe God created a male, female. I'm going to use gender appropriate, biological gender appropriate pronouns, even though the school policy says no. That's a religious freedom case. So that case, I'm expecting to get the local decision overturned based on Groff versus DeJoy. Okay. Last is gift acceptance policy. See if you have one. If you don't, let's get one. Monica, do you want me to take this? I have a question. What about supporting PACs? Right? Is this considered political activity? If it's for a candidate, then the answer is yes. Right. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Kevin Norton from Lightwell, which was formerly American Insurance Group. So I have to remember the new name, Lightwell. Their booth is back there, and Kevin's going to talk about some cyber fraud cases he's experienced in his insurance practice. Kevin?
Good morning, everyone. I think it's appropriate that I follow Bob Brown because in real life, I follow Bob Brown many times. You know, your churches or ministries will call Bob with an issue or a problem, and Bob will, consult with you, and then he'll say, I think you also better call Kevin or call your insurance carrier. So we appreciate all the work that Bob does on behalf of all the ministries here. And we appreciate partnering in ministry with all of you over the years. So what I can say to start out is God is moving and continues to move throughout the churches here in Arizona. And I see it on a daily basis as I partner with many of you. Oh, yep. There we go. But I see it on a daily basis as I partner with many of you, in handling your insurance and so forth. And I would say the job that you all do on a daily basis in keeping the churches operating in a safe manner, keep them operating in an orderly manner within the law and above approach, all that you guys do contributes greatly to the success and to the effective ministries that these churches have. So thank you for all that you do. And I know you all operate with different titles, church business administrators, financial controllers, chief financial officers, executive pastors, controllers. There's many titles you do, but you help keep the churches humming, don't you, on a regular basis. So thank you for all you do. I do want to mention that we do have a new name. We used to be American Church Group of Arizona for many years, and we just changed as of last Monday, October the 14th, and we are now known as Lightwell Insurance Advisors. And, what we're doing has not changed. Just our name has changed, but we will continue to minister to churches, to faith-based ministries throughout the state of Arizona and Utah. So even though you might see that name, and we still use Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company as our lead insurance company. And, there's many, well, you guys know what kind of insurance market we're in, right? It's been a tough market, not only from a church insurance perspective, but from a personal lines perspective. Just with your auto and home insurance, you've seen tremendous increases the past year or two. And, we see that too on a regular basis. So we're consulting with many of you. But there's a lot of insurance companies that have decided to stop insuring churches, or they've left the market. And it's been tough. And, Brotherhood Mutual has taken the opposite approach. Brotherhood Mutual has doubled down. They say all we do is Christian churches, Christian ministries, and we're going to continue as best as we can is to offer insurance to Christian churches and ministries throughout the United States. So Brotherhood is still our lead company. So the issue I'm talking about is just some of the cyber issues that we've seen. Churches have been the subject of a variety of cyber attacks the last few years. And we have all seen the emails. The threat actors, and that's a new word that I've learned here in the last couple of years. Threat actor are basically the bad people that are initiating these attacks against churches, businesses, and so forth. But the threat actors have become very sophisticated in running their schemes. And you guys have all seen the emails, right? A day doesn't go by where you probably get some email that is not a real email. I got two yesterday. This document that you are supposed to sign by DocuSign is still in your inbox. Please click on the link and sign the document. And I don't have any documents to sign, but they're sending you stuff that looks like it's something that you have to act upon, something that's urgent. Some of them are very easy to spot, because of misspelled words and not using proper grammar. But some of them look pretty good, don't they? And sometimes you have to look twice. Is this real or is this fake? So they've become very sophisticated in running their schemes. Hacked emails, and let me give you a few examples of what we've seen here just in the last couple years. Hacked email results in credit card deposits going elsewhere. You know, the threat actor, the bad people, intercept an email, hack an email from a church, and they see where your credit card deposits are going. They know what bank your credit card deposits are going to, so they call the processor, and they tell the processor, we're changing banks, so we want all our credit card deposits to go to this new account. And so the bank starts sending them the paperwork, the documentation. All the documentation gets signed, but it's all being signed by the bad people, the bad person. And so they get all the documents, they change the bank, and then all of a sudden credit card deposits are starting to go elsewhere. And then they're using stolen credit cards. And then the people are saying, you know, charges on their account to this church, say, that's not mine, please reverse it. And so then the chargebacks are going back against the church, and the churches are losing, you know, money. So that's one that we've seen. We had one a couple of years ago where the church had a new employee, and the new employee was going to be their payroll person. And so the payroll processor sent that new employee an email with a temporary password so they could get in and get, you know, set up in the payroll system. And you put in their own a new login and a new password. Well, that email was intercepted, and so the threat actor completed the password, and then they proceeded to go into the payroll system and change a number of bank accounts that the church employees' payroll would have gone into. So the payroll day came and went, and then a day or two later, the administrator for the church started getting calls, emails from the employees at the church saying, where's my paycheck? It's not in my account. And then they find out that the church payroll went to 15 different bank accounts. And the church lost, you know, $50,000 in a payroll. So that stuff is happening also. A church, and you've seen these, a church employee receives an email from the pastor asking that monies be wired to a missionary in need. And you've all seen them too, where the pastor wants you to go out and get some gift cards, you know, and then give them the numbers so then they can distribute those to people in the congregation. So we had one instance a couple years ago where the pastor sent an email. It wasn't the pastor, but the pastor sent an email to the church while the pastor was vacationing in northern Minnesota and was going to be out of cell range for a week. But the pastor said he wanted $47,000 wired to one of their missionaries. And the church employee cannot wire funds without another person being involved. So the employee got another person from the church board. They went down to the bank, the two of them, and they initiated a wire transfer of $47,000 that they thought was going to this missionary overseas. And of course, it went to some bad people, and the church lost $47,000. So you know, you just need to be aware that these things can happen in a church. And then finally, I've had a number of churches involved in these kind of situations, either with a building project or where they're involved in some type of remodeling or repair. And the church receives an email from one of the contractors, and it's from the accounts payable department, from the contractor, and they initiate a conversation with the church, and they start talking about, you know, what the process for paying invoices and so forth. And I can say, almost equate this to the abuse cases that we've talked about where there's a grooming process. I would call this a grooming process where the bad person starts emailing the church months before something bad happens, and they get into that relationship with this person. And then a couple months later, after they've been getting emails from this supposedly this electrician or this vendor, this contractor, saying we've changed our bank. In the future, when you get an invoice from us and you're going to pay it by ACH, you're going to be paying it to this new account that we've set up. And they send you documents, from the bank with the signature of the contractor. It makes it look very real. I had one church where they even got a copy of the check, their new checking account, the check. And the contractor was using a bank back east. The bank doesn't even operate out here in Arizona, but they were using a bank back east and say, here's a copy of our check. This is where we want all our proceeds to be paid to. And so, that goes on for a while. We've had situations where we've gone back after the fact and we see that the threat actors have set up an LLC or a corporation in another state, but they're using the same name as the vendor, the electrician. And they set up an account, they set up a corporation in another state, and then they open up a bank account in another state in that same name. And then the church receives the invoice, the fraudulent invoice, and then the church pays the invoice. And then, a week or two later, the contractor calls and says, where's our money? And he says, well, we paid it 2-3 weeks ago. And then they find out, they look back, and of course, it was paid to somebody else, and the money, the day the money goes into that account, the money gets swept out and goes somewhere, some other country. So it's happening all the time. So I just wanted to let you know about some of these things that are out there that are happening, just so you guys can remain vigilant and to watch out for these types of things. But I wanted to give you some best practices. I've talked to different people. I've talked to Brotherhood Mutual. I've talked to attorneys that are experts in cyber and asked them, what can churches do to prevent some of these things from happening? The first thing is they would say is never, ever pay an invoice by ACH without first contacting the vendor, the contractor. Whenever you get an invoice, you're not going to pay that unless you call them first over the phone and say, we've received this invoice, this is the account number that you want us to pay it to, and just verify everything over the phone. So always pick up the phone before you pay an invoice. Another thing is do not click on links. And what we have seen, something else I want to talk about. Before, when you start a project, a remodeling project, a building project, so forth, set up ahead of time the process and the procedures and the protocols that you'll be using to pay your invoices during the building project. Discuss the billing protocol, your communication, your verification, those types of things. Some of them even set up some clue words that you would use. So when you see that clue word, you're talking to the real person. But that doesn't eliminate the need to still pick up the phone and talk to them. But you want to discuss this prior. And if there's ever a change in bank with one of your vendors, that is a red flag. So always, when you see that change in bank, get on the phone and talk to the contractor. But regarding clicking on links, churches and nonprofits are more vulnerable than other types of businesses because nonprofits exist to help people, and so they are seen sometimes as an easier mark, from the threat actors. So maybe the employees or your volunteers that might be manning the phone, manning the computers, they might not be as savvy, even as some of us, but even as, we think we're savvy, we can still be taken too. So you need to make sure, and just tell those people, never click on links on emails, because that is where the issues can start. Once you click on a link, the threat actors, have access and, or they might shut you down or whatever. But don't click on links. Always be careful not to do that. Another thing I've learned recently is what contact information is on your website. You know, how did that church, that threat actor know to email the church and want this money wired to this missionary? Well, they went on the website, they saw the pastor's name, they saw the pastor's email, they saw a list of all the missionaries that the church supports on the website, and so they knew all the players. And so when they sent an email, it all looked very legitimate. You know, it all looked very legitimate. So what I have been told, and we all like to go on websites for churches, you know, they've got the staff page. We like to see all the pictures of the staff and the bios and so forth. And I like to see that just so we know who we're dealing with and so forth. But what I've seen recently is you cannot get an email of the pastor or any staff member on the website. So what I've seen a lot of churches do is they will have a contact us page. And the only way you can contact the church is by filling out that contact form and then somebody from the church responding to you. So nowhere on the website are any emails of any staff. So I'm starting to see that where a lot of that, those links are being taken off of church websites. So people can't get those because we get those emails all the time. You know, I get emails from my pastor saying, Dear Kevin, I'm in a prayer meeting right now. I can't be bothered. Please respond to this email as soon as possible, or what have you. I got an email yesterday from a pastor from a church we insure, and it says, Kevin, you haven't responded to my email. Please reply. Let me know that you got this. And I'm not going to reply to that. You know, I knew that that was not really an email from the pastor from the church. It was somebody that set that up. So what contact information is on your website? Have people visiting the website complete the online contact form. But insurance can help. So what we have seen is an increase in requests for cyber insurance. And when we talk about cyber insurance, we're talking about first-party cyber insurance and third-party cyber insurance. First-party cyber insurance is insurance that will cover if you get hacked, if you get shut down, and somebody demands a ransom before they put you back up or put your system back up. You know, you've got insurance that you can buy to protect, to try to get your system back up and running, or to help with ransom or extortion, those types of costs. And then there's what's called third party or liability, cyber liability, as if somebody hacks into your system and a bunch of data, personal, confidential information gets out there. And then you've got people that get upset because their personal information got compromised. And you've seen that with the large companies and so forth. So you can buy insurance to cover first-party losses and third-party losses. Brotherhood also has new coverage out that's called theft by coercion. Unfortunately, if you voluntarily pay an invoice and it's a fraudulent invoice, that is not considered the normal type of theft where somebody, you know, threatens you or somebody steals money from you. You have voluntarily sent that money to somebody else. And so there is insurance now that can protect you for something like that called theft by coercion, which would protect you from those schemes of the threat actors. And then also theft by electronic means, which will help for those instances where somebody actually gains access to your account through passwords and so forth and takes money out of your account. So there is insurance that can help in those types of instances. But the last thing I wanted to talk about was the training. And there's training available. A lot of you have you might have in-house IT people, or you might have third-party IT companies that help serve your church and ministry. But we would always recommend that you get some sort of training. And when we talk about training, what does that include? Well, it includes training and simulation. And let me talk about what that means. First, there's security awareness training. And basically what that does is it helps you recognize common scams so they can train you and say, these are the things that you need to look for. And they'll give you real world examples when they're training you. They also have what's called phishing simulations, where they will send out phishing emails to your staff. And have any of you ever been a part of that? Where they check then and see who responded, who clicked on the link. So it's just helping you become more aware, and it builds vigilance. So they'll do some sort of that. But what happens when an incident happens? You know, there's also training available. If a scam is suspected, the training covers how to quickly contain the issue and minimize losses, and has notification protocols. So they'll train you in that aspect also. Compliance and regulatory training. The training itself will be able to monitor, you know, if you've got 40 employees, you want all 40 of those employees and volunteers to go through the training. And so it can help, it'll give you reports on who has gone through the training, who has not, or who has only gone through a part of it, those types of things. But it can track compliance of who has and has not completed the training. And it'll help you follow best practices. And we all know this, strong passwords and password managers. We would encourage the use of strong, unique passwords and password managers that help securely store passwords, because we all have many, many logins and passwords to remember, don't we? And if you're like me, I've got a couple go-to passwords that I probably use on 10 or 15 different websites. You know, I don't remember what that password is, but I've got my go-to. I'll click in and hey, it worked. So don't use those go-to passwords all the time. And then finally, we all know, especially when you're getting into cyber insurance and trying to get coverage for extortion and ransomware, the insurance companies will want to know, well, do you have multi-factor authentication? So if you're off premises and you want to get access into your system, do you have to get a separate email or a separate text before you can log in? You know, so multi-factor authentications, that is the world we live in today. And so we would say that you need to set that up. So it just makes it harder for people to get into your system. And then finally, safe browsing practices, social media awareness. Again, avoiding the links, the random links in your emails, in social media. Even trustworthy websites that you might have visited many times. You know, you always need to be careful about clicking on links. Many attacks start with a simple click on a link. So what you're doing is you're building awareness. You also want to be cautious about accepting friend requests or following suspicious links. Because churches, you know, not only have a website, churches are on Facebook, they're on Instagram, they're on X, they're on all these different platforms. So you just need to be more vigilant, especially the more ways that churches can contact you. So I hope this has helped. Any questions? We're back at the table back there. Be happy to answer any questions. And there's my email address and my cell phone number on there also. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. I got one of those emails just yesterday from one of the churches I serve, receptionist at, and here's that document you requested, only I hadn't requested a document. So, Kevin, that was very helpful. Thank you. Just a reminder, the coffee shop is open, and Sam looks really lonely over there. Breakfast is still available. Feel free to get up anytime. We'll go through this presentation, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So just be aware, though, that you're free to get up anytime. Nobody's going to tackle you. So. Okay, so we're going to discuss the top 10 mistakes in church and clergy payroll this morning. And I see it at every church. There's no church who is immune from these, and we see it all the time. So just want to review the top 10 mistakes that people make in church payrolls. So housing allowances have to be approved by the board in advance of the payment. So you typically will do this November, December, or whenever your fiscal year start. You want to make sure it's in place before that housing allowance is paid. You can say, or until the housing allowance for, say, 2025 is approved, or until changed by the board. So that'll help protect you if you miss doing that. You want to document it in the minutes. You don't want to just say we approved the housing allowances. You want to document, you know, the names and amounts. You can change it mid-year, like if somebody's renting and then buys a house, you can change it mid-year, but it has to be done only going forward. And you want to show it as a separate item in payroll. It's really helpful for tax preparers if you put it on the W-2 in box 14. It's not required, but we do ask for tax preparers that you do that. And please do not pay the pastor's personal bills in lieu of a housing allowance. Give the pastor the housing allowance, let him pay his own bills. So we don't want to see that. This is a big one. Gifts to employees, including clergy, are taxable. So there are a few exceptions, very rare, very specific circumstances. So those gifts include gift cards. We often see that employees are given gift cards. It doesn't end up on the W-2 form, and that's a problem. Any gift card of 1 cent or more goes on a W-2. We also see pastor appreciation gifts, anniversary gifts. Those are taxable and need to be on the W-2 form. Sometimes we'll give pastor a cruise or a spa day or whatever it happens to be. So whether it's cash or non-cash, it's taxed the same. And it needs to be on that W-2 form. The only potential exception is that certain retirement gifts in very limited circumstances can be treated as tax-free. But those are very limited. It's for a long-time person, and there are certain ways you need to handle this. So if you get Richard Hammer's tax book, there's some good guidance in that, and I also recommend you all have Richard Hammer's Clergy and Tax Guide. So just to be aware, there may be an exception for that. So honorariums for employees, including clergy, are taxable and must be run through payroll. So let's say you have a wedding or a funeral, and the church charges for the pastor's time and then passes it through to the pastor. That is payroll. That is not a 1099, that is not a tax-free gift. It needs to be on payroll. Now, if the couple just pays the pastor directly, that's okay. You're out of it, you know, it's taxable to the clergy person, but it doesn't have to go on the W-2 because it didn't run through the church. So a lot of times we also see gift cards that are issued by, like, the women's ministry might give a gift card to the sound operators, and that needs to be treated on that person's W-2 if they're an employee, or on the 1099 if they're not an employee. What it is not appropriate to do for that employee is to issue a 1099 to that employee in addition to their W-2 if they're doing the same job. Now, if they have a different job or a different business, that's okay to have a 1099 going to that employee if it's completely different, but never for honorariums and that type of thing. So time and expenses for personal retreats or spiritual growth, we often see these kinds of things where we give pastor, 3 weeks off, or sabbatical falls into this, are taxable. So you have to remember that non-taxable expenses must be for the benefit of the church, not the employee. So if we send pastor to San Diego for 3 weeks for spiritual renewal or spiritual growth, that's taxable to that pastor. Things like conferences, when we send an employee of any sort to a conference, those are allowable as long as you're paying for travel the day before the event and the day after. If you pay for a week for a one-day conference, those extra days are taxable because they're personal typically. There's no business purpose to staying longer than the day before and the day after. If a spouse attends, which we often see, and some churches actually have this as a requirement that the spouse attend, it's always going to be taxable unless that spouse attends as a bona fide volunteer or employee. So if the spouse, say, is the volunteer children's ministry director, and she's going to courses about children's ministry, then that's fine. You can pay for a volunteer to go, or you can pay for another employee to go. What's not fine is if she goes and goes to the spa at the resort and goes shopping and all of that. That will be taxable to the employee. And you can see it different ways at different churches. So health insurance, this is always a big question. Health insurance and medical payments. And first we're just going to talk about health insurance. If your church has a group health insurance plan, it's non-taxable. It's a non-taxable benefit. You are not required to offer health insurance unless your church and any related entities that you have more than 50 full-time equivalent employees. So if your church has 20 employees, you can offer a group plan and people can participate or not participate as needed. But sometimes the plans require you to have like 50% of people participating. So you'll have to watch your group plans. So, if we have a group plan and somebody says, I don't want to participate because I have insurance through my husband, you may have to have minimum requirements from the insurance company. Under law, there's no minimum if you're under 50 employees. So that's how a group plan. And that will be tax-free. And you can discriminate. You can pay for some employees and not others if you're under 50 employees. You need to contrast that with paying for someone's medical bills. So this is co-pays, doctors, prescriptions. So reimbursement of those kinds of expenses that are not insurance requires a plan that does not discriminate. So you can't pay pastors' medical bills and not pay anybody else's. Okay, that type of plan, which is a health reimbursement arrangement, does not allow discrimination. So that means you cover everybody who meets certain criteria, like all employees over 36 hours or all employees over 32 hours. So you don't want to be reimbursing. Most churches do not reimburse medical expenses for their rank and file employees, and they shouldn't. And if they're not doing that, then they shouldn't be reimbursing the pastor's medical expenses. If you choose to reimburse for individual health insurance, okay, so this is health insurance that I go out and buy myself as an employee, and my church wants to reimburse me. You have to have, unless you just have one employee, if you have one employee, you're fine. So if you're a tiny little church and you want to pay for pastor's health insurance, you can do that. Otherwise, if it's more than one employee, you have to have a compliant plan in place. So this is a plan that spells out the criteria. There is criteria. You can't just say, we're going to pay, X amount of dollars, or we're going to pay everybody's health insurance regardless of what it looks like. So you want to be really careful with this plan because you have to follow the plan rules. So you have to adopt a plan, and then you would pay for the plan. Some of the pitfalls with these kind of plans are if people have medical sharing plans where they're not insurance, but like Christian Healthcare or Liberty Healthcare, where it's a sharing arrangement, it's not an insurance company. That is not insurance, and you can't reimburse it tax-free. You could reimburse it on a taxable basis, but you cannot reimburse it tax-free. People on Medicare, you have to be really careful because there's not only the Affordable Care Act rules, but there are rules under Medicare. And if you have more than 20 employees, you do not want to be reimbursing Medicare premiums because Medicare, it's considered an inducement. if you have a group plan. So just be aware Medicare has its own rules in regard to this. If your employee receives a subsidy on the marketplace, you know how you can sign up at healthcare.gov and it'll pay part of your premiums. If they're receiving a subsidy, they will lose that subsidy with $1 of reimbursement. So a lot of times clergy, because the housing allowance isn't taxable, clergy will get a subsidy on their insurance. And that is a problem under the Affordable Care Act for reimbursing the premiums. Another issue you need to watch for is if they're getting insurance through their spouse and it's pre-tax. So when they withhold insurance from that spouse's payroll, it's a pre-tax benefit, meaning no taxes have been paid on it. You cannot reimburse that tax-free because that's a double dip. So just be aware that there are some concerns with reimbursing. This link in here is a really good link for discussing health reimbursement arrangements for insurance. So if you want to see what kinds of plans are available, you can just click on that link and it'll give you some great information. Just dealt with this last week. Moving expenses. Moving expenses are taxable. So whether this is an allowance or whether you're directly paying for someone's moving expenses, it is taxable. And it is non-deductible by the employee as well. So if you pay a moving expense allowance, it's got to be run through payroll, it's got to be on the W-2. And that has been the law since 2018, and I just had 2 cases last week at the same church. So let's be real careful with that. So life insurance, where the employer, where the church is not the beneficiary, is taxable. So if we pay for a pastor's life insurance and his wife and kids are the beneficiary, that is a taxable benefit. The only exception to that is if you have group term life insurance. How many of you have group term life insurance in this room? Yeah, a lot of times you see it in denominational churches. My employees have group term life insurance too. So the first $50,000 of what the employer pays for on group term life insurance is tax-free. If they have $100,000 of coverage, there's a calculation you need to make and put on their W-2 form for that additional health insurance, or I'm sorry, life insurance. So this, but understand this is group term life insurance. If you don't have group term life insurance, then it's all taxable. If you have key man life insurance, which is where the church is the beneficiary of the policy, that is not taxable. So there's 3 kinds: key man or key person, now they say, where the church is the beneficiary, that's not taxable. If you have regular life insurance where the family is the beneficiary, that's fully taxable. And then group term life insurance is partially taxable. A lot of group term just provides $50,000, so you may not have to worry about it. But if they get 60 or 75 or 100,000, you need to worry about it. Clothing is taxable unless it would not be worn elsewhere. So like robes are fine, stoles are fine, polos with the church logo on are okay, t-shirts, that type of thing, vestments like a priest would wear. If it's anything else, the church, well, A, should not be paying for it, let me just say that, and then B, if you do pay for it, it is taxable compensation. And so IRS's basic premise is if it's not excluded under the IRS code, it's taxable. So if you can't find an exception in the IRS code, which is great fun to read, Code Section 102 is where you want to read. If it doesn't say it's an exception, then it's taxable. So that's the general rule. Auto allowances, this is a big issue we see in churches. We give our upper management or clergy an auto allowance. And it might be $400 a month, it might be $600 a month, it might be something. and the pastor never turns in 1 mile of business use because they don't want the record-keeping hassle. So if they are not turning in the miles, and if those miles currently at 67 cents per mile don't make up that auto allowance, then it's taxable. So if they turn in nothing, that auto allowance is taxable. Say they turn in enough to get $200 of the $400. The additional $200 is taxable. So a lot of your pastors don't like to track mileage, and a lot of boards say, oh, we'll just give him an allowance. He doesn't need to track mileage. But yes, you do need to track mileage. So if you're, and a lot of times pastors say, fine, just tax me. But just be sure that you're not giving tax-free auto allowances where you haven't accounted for the miles. If the church owns the automobile, which I had this case about 2 months ago, the value of the personal use, including commuting to and from the church, is taxable. And again, you have to keep track of business miles. If you don't keep track of business miles, then the value of that vehicle is taxable. And there's a very specific formula for determining that value. It's called the automobile lease value, and so it's a calculation you make based on the number of miles and the number of personal miles. So if they don't turn in anything, that value of the personal use of the auto, and they all have personal use because commuting is personal. So you want to be sure that that gets on the W-2. If a church credit card is used to put gas in a personal vehicle, it's taxable unless the mileage is accounted for. So make sure that if somebody's driving a load of kids up to camp in their own vehicle and they fill up when they go and they fill up when they get back, make sure that the number of miles that they drove times 67 cents a mile is accounted for. Then it can be tax-free. Otherwise, it's taxable if it's not accounted for. I had this one last week, too. It was a busy week last week. Okay, so education classes. So any employee can be reimbursed on a tax-free basis for job-related classes. So it has to be classes that are a benefit to the employer for the employee's current position. So it cannot be something that qualifies them for a new profession. So you can't have your children's ministry leader getting reimbursed for engineering classes. Okay? So just the class needs to relate to their current position. So if you have, you know, a new youth pastor and he takes a class on how to preach, that's fine. That's going to help him in his current position. So you look at each class on a tax-free basis. If they're enrolled in a degree program, you're going to take their schedule and you're going to say, well, that class helps him in his current position. This one doesn't. This one does. And this one does. So you can reimburse 3/4 of it as on a tax-free basis, but 1/4 of it's going to be taxable. Now, the call I always get is, I read we can pay our pastor to get his, to get his seminary degree, and we can pay him up to $5,250. And that statement is half right. So the problem with the educational assistance plan is, yes, you can reimburse up to $5,250, but you cannot discriminate. You have to cover all your employees. I never see this plan in churches. This is something that Microsoft does, Apple does, Amazon does, where they're covering any degree program, any education, and they're covering all eligible employees. So you can, it could be all full-time employees. So I never see this in churches because the hit to the budget would be incredible, number one. Number two, you're training your children's ministry leader to be an engineer. So we really don't want to do that either. So this plan, while it does exist and while it is out there, really doesn't help in a church situation. Your best bet if you want to pay for education is to use the other method where we look at each course, tax-free if it helps you in your current profession, taxable if it doesn't. So that is the easiest way to deal with education benefits. The call last week was paying for pastors to finish his PhD. So, you know, they wanted to do this plan. And I said, not unless you're going to cover everybody. So what we need to do is look at those courses. And typically at a PhD level, it's all going to be related. But when you start looking at bachelor's degrees, like taking English 101 or beginning biology, you know, that's where you really run into issues with, does it relate? And I say this every year, and every year I have pastors crying on the phone that they don't have enough money for retirement because they opted out of Social Security. And like Jonathan said, they thought they would put all their money in their IRA and they didn't. And so they have nothing for retirement. And there's just is no reason for a church not to have a 403b-9 plan. The 9 indicates it's a church plan. So if you're not a church, you'll just have a regular 403b for nonprofits. The 9 has special rules for church plans. So any employee can contribute pre-tax or to a Roth 403b. Church employers, and notice I'm saying church, not ministry, not other, church employers could still discriminate on employer contributions. So if they only want to make a contribution for the pastor, they want to give the pastor the most and the other employees less, they can still do that. What's great about the 403b-9 plan is it escapes taxation when it goes in, and if you do it right, it escapes it coming out because you can establish a housing allowance for your pastors who are retiring. Church doesn't have to pay it, but they can treat those distributions out of that plan as housing allowance. So it's not tax going in and it's not tax going out. It's the best deal ever for pastors. And the good thing about a 403b-9 plan is there's no ERISA or other filing requirements, so it's pretty easy to manage. How many churches here have a 403b-9 plan? Not very many. Okay, we do. Yeah. So really think about this. What are you setting your pastors up for? You're just. And then here's the call that comes after this. So pastor's 66 and he needs to retire. How can we get him $400,000? I swear that is the call that we get. And it's like, you know what? You can't plan after the fact. You just can't. Or we're closing the church and we want to give all the money to the pastor because we didn't do anything about his retirement. That doesn't work either. So please, please, please get these plans set up. Okay, and this is going to be on my headstone. I swear. Every church I walk into, I just did a tax return for a pastor who started with a new church, and dang it, this was the issue. They never, ever, 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 can we all say that together? Never, ever, 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 ever have Social Security or Medicare withholding at the employer level. Okay, is everybody? So when you look at your payroll journal, there should not be Social Security and Medicare ever, ever, ever coming out of a clergy person's payroll. So some people will say, well, he opted out. Well, I don't care. Opting out does not matter. The form to opt out is the 4361. I don't care if he filed that. There is nothing that changes the statement. Nothing. If he's clergy, he doesn't have Social Security or Medicare. And if he's functioning as clergy, he doesn't have an option. Okay, I sometimes have people say, well, my accountant said it's better not to be treated as clergy, but you are clergy. If you're clergy, if your church says you're clergy, you say you're clergy, and you have to be taxed as clergy. It's not a choice of the employee. So just be aware that this is a huge issue, and there was a court case about a rabbi who decided he got, towards the end, and guess what? He had no retirement. So he decided that the church should start paying in Social Security and Medicare on him, and they did, or the temple, synagogue, and so they did. They thought that was great. They paid in 9 years or something, and he went to file. He had filed Form 4361, by the way, and he went to file, and Social Security said, no, and the church couldn't get any of the money back. He couldn't get any of the money back because of the statute of limitations. So they paid in for like 9 or 10 years, couldn't get any of the money back. He still was in the same boat of having no Social Security. And, that organization was in a pickle. Not only did they spend money foolishly, but their big plan didn't work. So just be very aware of this. And this is the number one of my top 10 mistakes that churches make. So let's all go home and look at our payroll runs and be sure that we're consistently treating our clergy as clergy. So if payroll is not done correctly, it can result in big problems for the church, the board, and its employees. Because if you have highly compensated people in your organization, and that's defined in the IRS code, and something is not on their W-2 but should have been, it is considered automatic excess benefit payments to that person, subject to penalties of 225%. It's horrific if somebody has excess benefit. And just by virtue of not putting that on the W-2, it's automatically excess benefit. So it can cause big problems. Okay, we are going to take a 10-minute break. Again, poor Sam over there is lonely. Help yourself to breakfast. Restrooms are down the hall here. And there's water and coffee up here as well. And be sure you drop your business cards in the vendor booths or the little slips that we gave you, because we'll have door prizes at the end of the event. Thank you.
My name is Julie Froke, and I work for Monica. Huge blessing. And I was a church administrator for many years here in the Valley, attended many seminars of Monica's seminars. That's how I got to know her. And so today, in past years, we've talked a lot about accountable reimbursement plans. Today, I want to focus a little bit on managing accountable reimbursement plans. This can be a difficult thing for churches and ministries because there's so many volunteers, so many employees that are involved in the mission of the organization. As a quick recap, for accountable reimbursement plans, it's a method for reimbursing employees for any ministry-related expenses on a non-taxable basis. So if your reimbursement plan does not follow the IRS guidelines, then it is by default a non-accountable reimbursement plan. The problem with a non-accountable reimbursement plan is that any reimbursements that are made that don't follow the guidelines of the IRS, that should be included in taxable income. So it would be on the employee's W-2, and the church or ministry would need to pay payroll tax on it. So accountable reimbursement plan is not included in taxable income, but a non-accountable plan, the reimbursements are included in taxable income. So what are the requirements for a accountable reimbursement plan? First, there has to be a business, or in this case, a ministry connection. Or it has to be something that's involved directly with the church or ministry's operations or with the employee's job duties, okay? there has to be timely substantiation. So that would be some type of written documentation, like a receipt, that would prove, I heard a few snickers there, receipts, that prove that this was a business or church-related expense. And it has to be done in a timely fashion. Now, the IRS has indicated that to be 60 days. So if there's an expense, within 60 days of that expense to be reimbursed for it to be called an accountable reimbursement. There also has to be return of excess amounts. So if you are advancing an employee funds for expenses, or you reimburse them for more than what the expense actually was, those funds have to be returned to the church within a timely fashion, or in a timely fashion. And that, the IRS would say, is 120 days. Not sure why they're different, but they are. So some examples of non-accountable plans. If reimbursements are non-accountable, again, the important thing to know is that they are taxable income. So the church has to pay payroll tax on them, and they have to show up on the employee's W-2. Here's some examples. Monica touched a little bit on the auto allowance, giving an employee an auto allowance or a gas allowance every month, and not requiring any mileage reporting to make sure that actually the mileage equals what the reimbursement was. That is taxable income, needs to be on the W-2. Not collecting receipts from employees. If your plan does not require collecting receipts for any reimbursements, that is taxable income. Some churches might go with a quarterly or annual expense reporting, and that plan would not be accountable because it's not in a timely fashion. Monica did mention the auto allowance. Now, a cell phone allowance, we often get that question. That can be done on a tax-free basis. And there are other things like that, fringe benefits that can be done. So if you want more information on fringe benefits, the IRS publication is 5137. So IRS publication 5137, and it's a good resource for fringe benefits called Fringe Benefit Guide for Tax-Exempt Organizations. Okay, one question we get is, do accountable reimbursement plans have to be written? And the answer to that is no. The IRS does not require them to be written, but we would strongly suggest that you have a written plan that your board has approved. But if in the past you have not had a written plan and you've been reimbursing employees, as long as you're following those 3 requirements, then you don't have a taxable income issue. But going forward, you really should approve a plan, have your board approve a plan, and we have copies. I said on my slide there that we actually have a sample plan in your handouts, but there's a stack of them with a net at the check-in table. So if you're interested in a plan, pick that up on your way out. Okay. Now that we have the plan in place, the real work begins, and that's managing the plan. Just having a plan in place doesn't count if you're not following it. Okay, so the process of ensuring that all 3 of those requirements are met is going to require some kind of a system. Just having the plan, like I said, is not going to just magically happen. So we need a system of some sort to make this happen. This includes deciding if you want to use credit cards, if you want to stick solely, a lot of small churches just do reimbursements. A lot of other churches may have church credit cards. And just to note, the IRS does consider credit card charges as reimbursements. So they're subject to the same requirements for substantiation and all the other requirements. One of the benefits of having just a reimbursement, so an employee either gets an advance, brings that back with receipts and any money left over before they can have more advanced to them for expenses, or just straight up reimbursement where an employee may have an expense and then bring the receipt and get reimbursed. The great part about that is it's really easy to get receipts, because no receipt, no reimbursement. Credit cards, the benefit is ease of use, ease of ministry use. We don't want to bog down people who are doing the work of the mission of the church or the ministry. But the hard part about that is getting receipts, okay? So, and also misuse of credit cards is the #1 way that fraud happens in churches. So it is an issue more than just following IRS guidelines. It's about protecting the resources of the church. So one idea is to treat credit cards as a privilege. It's not a right for an employee to have a credit card. So if you have employees who have a problem or struggle with the accountable reimbursement plan, just take the card away. And that sounds funny, but it truly does you can advance them money and handle it that way, or reimburse them, and I guarantee you will get receipts. Okay, again, employees are good if they know to get reimbursed that they have to have a receipt. Okay, or they're going to lose a credit card and it's going to be taxable income. Okay, so like I said, there needs to be some kind of a system to manage the accountable reimbursement plan. How are you going to get receipts? How are you going to get documentation? How are you going to control and protect against fraud? So I'm just going to give you a couple ideas of plans that you can use. There are many other plans. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some ideas to get you guys talking. Okay, so the paper plan. As a church administrator years ago, this is what we did. This was before all the apps where you could upload receipts and all of that. And I'm dating myself, but the paper plan may include like a reimbursement form. We used to call it a check request form, something where an employee or volunteer has an expense and they fill out the form, turn in the receipt, and they get reimbursed. It would include receipts with details and ministry purpose. It might include periodic expense reports, and that would be for credit cards, specifically for credit cards. Also for advances, where you're advancing an employee or a volunteer money for expenses, you might have an envelope. This sample is available also with a net, and it's just a sample that you would print on a 5x7 envelope that has the employee or volunteer's name, when the envelope needs to be back to follow the plan, places to list the receipts, and then your employee would put receipts in any change in the envelope and turn it back by whatever date you note. So this might be included in a paper plan, and this is also, like I said, available with a net. Okay, if you have credit cards, how do you manage credit cards on this idea of a paper plan? What does that kind of a system look like? And any of you that have church credit cards know that it's very difficult to follow the plan because it's very difficult at times to get receipts. There's always at least one or two employees that very hard to get receipts from. So the system that we used at our church that became very effective was to download, however you get charges from your credit cards into your accounting software, whether that's downloading or manually entering them. Have someone on your staff that daily, a couple times a week, downloads those transactions, enters them into your accounting software, and have some way to tag them in the software. So our method was we just left the memo blank. If we did not have a receipt, we left the memo blank. Then it's really easy to run a report for each credit card, sort it by memo, or however you tagged it, so that those missing receipts float to the top. And you can email those reports to employees, you can print them, highlight the missing receipts, put them in their box. And this is just a regular, frequent thing. It's not, we're waiting till the end of the month to say this is what we're missing. We found that just being on top of it continually was much easier to get receipts than trying to do it after the fact. And then another thing is to find someone on your staff that can be responsible for missing receipts. So in our office, it was the receptionist. Everybody walked by the receptionist. So she would get these printed reports, highlighted the missing receipts, and she would just talk to every employee that came in the office. Oh, hey, do you have that Starbucks receipt from yesterday? Oh, yeah, I have that in my wallet. And so we got much better at getting receipts when we had somebody who was responsible for following up on receipts. So a lot of churches now are using a digital plan. There's a lot of software, apps, many different options for uploading, scanning and uploading receipts and processing expense reports. One option is Expensify. There's many others, but I think that was one of the early ones in these types of apps. Most of them integrate with payroll, so if you reimburse through payroll, it integrates with your payroll system and also with your accounting software. You can scan receipts, upload them into the mobile app, and you can process expense reports with details and everything needed right there in the app. Another option is for a mileage tracker. So mileage tracking apps, one option would be Mile IQ. Am I on the right slide here? Nope. There we go. Mile IQ is one option, but again, there's many. Even QuickBooks Online has some options with certain versions. And as Monica said, you can't, just as a reminder, you can't just straight up reimburse for gas. An employee or volunteer fills up their tank, brings you the receipt. We do see that all the time. So without mileage, without ensuring that that meets the 67 cents per mile that the IRS allows for 2024, that's taxable income. Okay, another option would be the prepaid card plan, and we do have a lot of churches that use these. One option is a PEX plan. These can be physical or virtual cards. You can set a spending limit on each card, and you can change it very quickly just through the app. So if there's a big purchase that an employee needs to make, you can increase it for the one purchase. And that is also helpful with managing your budgets. So you know your children's ministry budget, and you can set these prepaid cards accordingly. And you can also help with cash flow for your ministry by setting these amounts. Also with these apps, the employee can upload their receipts as well. There's no reason in today's world why you can't get receipts. Okay, so these are just a few of the ideas for digital plans. There's a lot of them, like I said, so many that it's hard to decide which one is right for you. So one thing we do suggest is network with other administrators. This is a good opportunity here to meet people and get phone numbers and follow up. And another great opportunity is, I'm going to do a plug for the church network, TCN. John and Heidi are back there. I would highly recommend stopping by their booth before you go. As a church administrator, I was part of TCN for many years and found that very, very helpful in meeting other people who did the same work I did, which can be difficult. Okay. Another thing would be to keep it simple. Keep the plan simple. You have a much better chance of success if you keep the plan simple. Simple for you and specifically simple for your employees. Okay, they're busy doing the work of the ministry, so if you can keep this part of it simple, you're doing your part of the ministry. Be consistent. Don't let it, fall by the wayside, and at the end of the month, now we're trying to scour and find all these receipts and handle all these types of details. Be consistent. And then also follow up with employees on a regular basis. Don't wait. Follow up regularly. Again, have that person who's responsible for that, for following up regularly. Okay, the bottom line. To qualify for tax-free status, reimbursements must meet specific IRS requirements, like we talked about. Business-related or ministry-related, adequately accounted for, so substantiated in a timely fashion, and excess amounts returned. The bottom line is that I have talked a lot today about IRS regulations, about consequences if you don't have a plan and follow the plan, if you don't use a system. But the truth is, it does sound very legalistic, and the IRS, and we hear that all the time. But the truth is that I know every person here wants to be a good steward of God's resources. We don't want to waste money. We don't want theft. And so having an accountable plan, following it, and making sure you're handling those things well is going to help protect the resources that God has entrusted to you and to your ministries. So, thank you.
Test 1, 2. Is it working? Okay. Yeah, took a little minute there. I would also add, I had a church that about maybe 8 months ago signed up with Expensify, and they gave everyone and their dog a card. And I was looking at their expenditures for the year, and oh my gosh, the revenue was flat, but the ministry expenses went through the roof. And what that tells me is that there's not somebody monitoring what is being spent. Like it felt like a little bit of a free-for-all. So somehow you need to monitor people's expenses when they, are handed a card in free spending. So it's very important that you monitor, that you reconcile every month if you're going to use that type of system, and that it's not just a free-for-all. So that's my comment on that. Okay, we're going to talk about the Department of Labor and the white-collar wages. So you know how the Department of Labor does things. They dink around for a few years, and they make threats about, raising the salaries and that type of thing. Well, this year they finally did something and made a final rule as of April 23rd of 24. So the last change was effective in 2020, so now we're in 24. And that new change is effective July 1st. So hopefully you all have addressed this, because this went into effect July 1st. It not only goes into effect July 1st, but there's another increase in January. So whether you've addressed the July 1st changes, you need to also address the January 1st changes. So what this is affecting is the white-collar minimum wage for exempt employees. So effective January 1st, that new salary is going to be $58,656, which is a substantial increase. Right now, it is $43,888, so until January. So this is one of the few times where they've done a stepped approach to the minimum wage, and this is for our exempt employees. Then starting in 2027, which I actually like this idea, and every 3 years thereafter, there will be automatic increases. So instead of having these huge jumps that we fight about in court for years, they're just going to increase it automatically using a prescribed methodology. So with this law change, the duties changed, and the non-salary based requirements do not change. So we still have the administrative professional, we still have all of those categories of employees. The only thing that they're changing right now in this particular law is the amount of salary that an employee needs to earn to be considered an exempt employee. So this is a quote from the acting secretary, Julie Sue, that this promises workers that if you work more than 40 hours in a week, you should be paid for that time. It's that simple. They feel like workers are getting shorted in their pay when they're paid too low of a salary for unlimited hours. So there's been some court challenges, and each part of this law is severable from the other parts, meaning they could change a part of the law, like the automatic increases. They could change that part of that law, or they could change the dollar amount. They have not been successful to date, so it's unlikely to affect the January 1st change. It didn't affect the July 1st change. So we're approaching that second part of the law where in January it goes up again. So these DOL rules, Department of Labor, that I'm referring to are part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA. So you'll see me referring to the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. So when we talk about employees, we talk about exempt employees, and exempt employees are those who are not subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act regarding overtime. Okay, so when we talk about exempt, non-exempt or covered, sometimes they're called covered, are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it requires overtime. Now we also have the term salaried employees. These are employees who are paid a fixed amount of pay for each work week. And then hourly employees, obviously, are paid hourly. So I sometimes hear churches getting these terms mixed up. So it's not appropriate to say, I have a salaried employee. You might have an exempt employee who is salaried, but those are not the same terms, because you can have salaried non-exempt employees in certain cases, or you could have hourly exempt employees. So the salaried and hourly is a method of payment. Exempt or non-exempt means what happens with overtime. So those are different things. So we want to be sure we're not confusing the terms. So for an employee to be exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime regulations, they have to meet a duties test. And this duties test right now in this legislation did not change. This also keeps flipping around with Department of Labor and IRS fighting over what the rules are. So the work has to be executive, administrative, professional, outside sales, computer employee. Okay, so do they meet the duties test first? And they need to be paid the minimum salary. And that's the part we're talking about today. Are they paid the minimum salary? And is that salary fixed and paid without deducting anything except as allowed? So is that salary paid each and every week with very limited exceptions? So again, if they're exempt, that overtime pay is not required for working more than 40 hours in a work week. So employees who are paid less than the minimum salary cannot be an exempt employee. So if you are not paying in January that $58,656, that employee is no longer exempt. Okay, because that is a requirement. And that's assuming that the duties test applies and that they're paid each and every week. You cannot prorate it for part-time employees. So you can't say, well, I'm going to pay $29,000 because that employee works half-time. Nope, they're not exempt then because you're not paying that full amount of the salary. The salary is all or nothing. Now, the good news is there are exceptions. And this is really important for my church people that are in here. If you're from another nonprofit, this likely will not apply to you, although it could in certain cases. So clergy, toss them out. You can pay them whatever you want. They are not under this. So clergy, just get them out of your sight and forget about them, okay? Teachers. So how many of you have a school or a preschool? Okay. So teachers are exempt from minimum wage and overtime, which is ridiculous in my opinion, and it includes preschool teachers, but not daycare or nursery workers. So it has to be a teacher teaching a curriculum in a school, and preschools count. Now, daycare does not count. It has to have an actual curriculum. So if you have teachers, throw them out. Just forget them. You don't have to include them in this law change. Okay, so some employees will also be exempt because they don't work in interstate commerce where the employer is not a covered employer. So what does that mean? We have an issue with having covered employers. So not every employer is a covered employer. So a covered employer has to do more than $500,000 in annual sales or business done, and contributions don't count. So this would be like if our coffee shop did $500,000 a year, which Sam would be loving that, or our books or our gift shop. If we did more than $500,000 a year in those things, then this church would be a covered employer. Most churches are not covered employers. However, an employee who works for a covered or non-covered employer, if they engage in interstate commerce, then they will be covered employees, okay? So let's look at what interstate commerce is. So interstate commerce can be interstate phone calls or faxes, can be shipping or mailing to another state, can be ordering goods online from another state, can be being involved in credit card processing, or emails to individuals in another state. So how many think that most employees are going to be covered employees? They are. Unless you're like on a janitorial crew that you never ever order any cleaning supplies or that kind of thing, it's likely that your employees are going to be covered employees even if your church is not a covered employee or covered employer. Does that make sense? Most churches and ministry employers will not be covered employers, but most employees of churches and ministries will be covered employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. But there's another exception. So what we have is called the ministerial exception. Now, I told you we're already threw the clergy out, right? Clergy are over here, teachers are over here. We don't care about them. What we're talking about now is non-clergy staff. So this might be your youth leader, might be your children's ministry leader, who are not clergy. So now we're talking about non-clergy staff who fall under the court's definition of ministers, not to be confused with clergy. So ministers can be exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and there's the famous court case for this is the EEOC versus Hosanna Tabor. So if you want some light reading tonight, you can look up that case. The key with this is the employee must have important religious duties as a part of their job. Now, I'm going to get emails. Can you send us that checklist for the ministerial exemption? And I'm like, no, there's no checklist. So there's no real clear criteria. You want to proceed with caution if you're dealing with non-clergy, okay? There is a DOL fact sheet. 17A. And these fact sheets are kind of easy reading sheets about Department of Labor topics. So there's one for 17A for exempt employees. So remember, if we peel off our clergy and we peel off our teachers, and if we peel off these employees who have essential religious duties, that's the ministerial exception, the rest are subject to this Fair Labor Standards Act and the minimum salary. So there's a good analysis here. I've given you the link for the analysis of the ministerial exemption. It's called exemption or exception, so there's two ways of pronouncing it, but anyway, so you'll want to look at those types of things. So the key points with the ministerial exception is the job title is not binding. Okay, so I don't want to see, the minister of first impressions, the minister of facility management. I've seen it all. Just putting minister in front of everybody's job title is not going to cut it, So the job title is not binding. The job description is not binding if that isn't what the employee's doing. So I sometimes see job descriptions and the employee looks at it, well, I don't do that, So you have to be careful with this. So the job description is not binding, nor is the title. What matters is, what is that employee actually doing? And what are they expected to do in regard to essential religious duties? So the duties have to involve an important role in conveying the church's message and carrying out its mission. So they have to have duties that represent that. So your accountant is probably, or bookkeeper is probably not going to qualify under this. But you may have, employees who have important religious duties. Kristen, who stood up here this morning, she has very important religious duties in leading the children and family ministry. She does the children's moment every week at church. You heard her say she's going to go to do chapel for 140 preschools, bless her heart. So she would have important religious duties. And again, there's no checklist. So, you're just going to have to determine this. You can read through the cases, that Hosanna Tabor case is a good one. So you want to consider revising job descriptions to list all the important religious functions the employee will actually do and is expected to do. And you also probably want to address, and you can talk to the attorneys back here about how to address that, but you want it clear that you're relying on the fact that they have important religious duties, and so you don't get sued by somebody who said, hey, I didn't get the minimum wage, when they acknowledge that they meet the requirement for the ministerial exception. Okay? So you may want to have that in your offer letter or your contract if you intend to rely on it. You don't want to just say, well, we're just going to ignore this law because all the employees meet that requirement. That's what you don't want to do. Because in an employment case, the rule is the employee wins. I mean, really, it's pretty much how our state government and the feds work with this, is you're likely to lose. So this is just a little statement from the Department of Labor that it has to be answered on a case-by-case basis, requires considering all relevant circumstances, and that each person and each particular position has the fundamental purpose of the exception. So it's got to have important religious duties in carrying out the employer's mission and conveying the employer's message. Troublesome areas in churches that we see is when I walk into a church and I see everybody's on a salary of some sort, oh my goodness. That's right up there with the FICA and Medicare, and those folks probably have that too. So these are the troublesome areas that we see, are administrative employees who are paid less than the minimum salary, and custodial staff, We often see that they get X amount per week without any regard to the fact that they typically, blue-collar workers must be hourly compensation. Musicians are hairy because sometimes they're contractors, sometimes they're employees. AV tech staff, sometimes they're contractors, sometimes they're employees. Most often, if they're there every single week, they are probably going to be employees, so you need to be careful with them. Social media people, and daycare and nursery workers. And my pet peeve is when churches pay 16-year-olds as contractors for nursery work, because that's saying we don't supervise or control these people. You think that's a problem with a 16-year-old nursery worker? Yeah, that's a problem. So what you want to do now is review all the employees who may qualify for the ministerial exception. Okay, so go through your payroll summary. I suggest just taking your payroll report that you get every time you do payroll, one by one, evaluate whether that employee is reasonably paid under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And then determine which employees, and I'm sure you will have some, need changes. Almost every church I walk into, when I look at their payroll, they have DOL violations. You want to fix any non-compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act in regard to duties. So if you are paying your janitor on a salary basis, you probably have an issue. And then to determine how to address employees who will no longer be exempt or never should have been exempt in the first place. Because now we're talking that increased salary. And that salary's high for a lot of your staff. The churches who have chosen to have implemented this appropriately have said, you know, we maybe can't raise people to $58,000. We may have to just convert them. So what are your options? You can increase the salary to $844 a week. You can treat as non-exempt and pay hourly with overtime as required. And then there are some legal hybrid methods under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Okay, so non-exempt employees can be paid a salary if the hours are tracked to ensure that they're getting minimum wage or whatever their stated rate of pay is, and overtime is paid for hours worked in excess of 40 in a week. So that's the simple method. There's a prorated salary option which allows you to pay a salary, but you have to pay time and a half for over 40 in a work week. So you could say your salary is $30,000, but if they work over 40 in a work week, then you have to pay time and a half. So in the fixed salary method is you only pay the half time unless minimum wage is not reached. So there are some ways of doing this. That fixed salary method can only be used if their salary fluctuates regularly between more than 40 and less than 40. So this isn't for somebody who's consistently working over 40 or consistently working 30 hours. It's got to fluctuate up and down in order to use that second method. So under the prorated salary method, you can prorate the salary for any hours not worked, but you have to pay time and a half for hours over 40. This is really hourly, but there is a special little niche for it. So if you want to pay somebody, say, $30,000 a year, and it covers 30 hours a week, this is something you could use, but you have to pay time and a half, and you have to pay for those hours over, well, you have to guarantee that 30 hours. So I've got some examples. I'm not going to go through the math here. You can look at this. We're kind of on a time crunch here. But you can look at these examples to see this is the prorated salary example. And what it basically boils down to is you're guaranteeing a salary. And if they don't work at all during a week, you don't have to pay it. But if they work one day, you have to pay it. the whole salary. The fluctuating is intended to compensate for all hours worked, whether many or few, but you have to fluctuate. It has to be somebody who fluctuates, and it can't be used if an employee must work specific fixed hours. So this isn't going to, your receptionist, this isn't going to work. You know, they're working X amount of hours per week. So there are some further examples of how to implement this if that employee qualifies here. So if you're going to use the fluctuating one, you have to look at what the maximum number of hours that employee will work and make sure the salary is large enough so that the regular wage doesn't fall below minimum wage on an hourly basis. You want to get salary arrangements for non-exempt employees in writing. So if you choose to use one of these fluctuating work weeks or the prorated salary method, you want to get it in writing, you want to give them examples, and time records have to be prepared and monitored. Okay? You're going to have a lot more timekeeping under this change. Because if you're not going to pay these people the amount of salary, then you're going to have a lot more timekeeping. So the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't require time clocks, but requires accurate time reporting for non-exempt employees. Doesn't require stop and start times, but it does require total hours and overtime hours. And you can use exception reporting for employees that have regular fixed hours. So exception reporting is where I say, okay, I'm the receptionist, I'm scheduled for 32 hours. I'm going to let you know whether I work more or less than 32 hours. Okay, so this week I worked 30. Next week I worked 34. So you want to be careful if you rely on this to make sure that you're getting an exception report for over or under. It can be risky for the employer if adequate records are not maintained. So in other words, you should get an exception report when that employee has worked more hours. And if you know that employee is working more hours, you are mandated to pay them. So if your receptionist is in there on Friday on her day off and she's working but never reports an exception to you, that's a problem because you are required to pay her. You can fire her for working unauthorized hours, but you still have to pay. So you must have a report for every work week. So just make sure that you do that. So if you have questions about this, you can email us. And I do suggest there's another plug for the church network. So please see those folks in the back. And but can I just reiterate, because I don't want a mailbox full of things. Our associate pastor only earns, okay, so what do we say to that? We don't care. We don't care about your associate pastor, okay? Wait, we do care, but we don't care about him in this context. So we're peeling off clergy. Who else? And who else? Ministerial exception. Okay. What you're dealing with is the rest of the people, okay? But you do need to clarify for those ministerial exception, make sure you have documented it, and make sure the employee understands that you're relying on the ministerial exemption, okay? Are there any questions? I'll take some questions if you have questions on this particular topic. And I hope next year not to talk about the Department of Labor. I get really tired of talking about the Department of Labor, but it just seems like every year there's something. Okay, I do remind you to stand, and Jen will give you a microphone. Whoops, just a minute. Here, leave it. She's just got
Facility managers, even if they control the budget, do all of the contract negotiations, have people that report to them, should still be probably non-exempt? Or could they be exempt?
Who's the people?
Facility managers.
Okay, okay, and I know this personally. So a facility manager, in order to be exempt, has to supervise 2 or more full-time employees, and they cannot do the same work their employees do. So who has a facility manager that doesn't set up tables? Okay, so your facility manager has to supervise 2 or more full-time employees and must not do the same work that those employees do. So they're an hourly, they're going to be non-exempt. They'll be covered by Fair Labor Standards Act and receive overtime in some manner.
Camps.
Yeah.
Could you address, you know where I'm going with that. Just when we have workers and then they're going to camp and they're there 24 hours plus.
The Department of Labor, if you go look on their website, you can count sleeping time if they're legitimately allowed to sleep. So I worked at a Girl Scout camp. John, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, the other thing is, in addition to what you're describing, there's 2 things. One is that there's a seasonal recreational exemption.
Yeah.
That if the camp does not operate more than 7 months out of the year, then they're exempt from minimum wage and overtime.
Yeah.
Also, the other test for seasonal is if the income from any 6 months, doesn't have to be consecutive, any 6 months is less than a third of the other 6 months, then your employees are exempt from minimum wage and overtime. So that's a seasonal and recreational exemption.
I think, though, what he might be referring to, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that we send our youth minister to camp with a group of kids. Or let's just say we send our, a worker, some workers, to camp with our kids. Is that what we're saying? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Let's wait for a microphone when we ask questions. So, yeah, so maybe they work 5 hours a week, I think you said? Say they work 20 hours a week and then they go to camp and they work 100. So, I do know there are sleep provisions in there, and yeah, then that's a problem. It is. So you would want to look up the Department of Labor for sleep time for sure, and travel time is also in there in the Department of Labor site. So yeah, it's a problem. Some of your people who are going to camp, though, may qualify under a ministerial exception. You want to stand up?
Yeah. My question I had was, what if you have an employee who 50% of what he does is a minister, and the other 50% is like our facilities guy? How would you do that?
So 50% of the time is spent doing facilities, and 50% is actually being a minister. That's going to be an issue for sure. So you're going to most likely, and I don't know, John, if you have any comments on that, but you would have to look at the preponderance. They have to have significant religious duties, and you may want to bifurcate the salary, but you still have to consider all of the time in regard to overtime. So, Miss Julie has a question.
Not actually, somebody from the online feed.
Oh, online question.
If you can speak to fact sheet 14A.
What about
Department, that's just what the question was. Department of Labor fact sheet 14A. Does that still apply?
I think that's the one about administrative and professional. I'm not talking about that today because it didn't change yet. That'll probably be forced into talking about it the next time. So, yeah, that's the classification. Remember, in order to be exempt, you have to fall under one of the administrative, professional, blah, blah, blah. That's that fact sheet. Then you have to be paid the minimum salary. And so, you have the duties and the salary test. And you have to be guaranteed that salary each and every week unless you work 0 hours. So that is. Any other questions? Okay, we are going to move on. And I'm sorry a lot of this goes fast, but we just have a lot to cover, and that's why we give you slides with lots of references on them. Okay, our next topic is the rental of church property. This one was the most requested topic this year. So we're going to cover the rental of church property. I know I've covered it before, but it's a good reminder for everyone. So when we talk about the concerns that we have with the rental of church property, is the first thing we're concerned about is unrelated business income tax. So this is corporate income tax that is assessed by the U.S. government and by Arizona Department of Revenue. So you pay it you file tax returns. Even if you're not filing a 990, you'll file a 990T to report unrelated business income tax. The second concern we have is property taxes. What will renting this do to your property tax issues? You know, are you going to have to pay property taxes on your property? And then lastly, we have the transaction privilege tax. If you're here in Arizona, that amounts to a county tax and potentially a city tax. So, and then lastly, we worry about the loss of IRS exempt status. And John spoke about this in his presentation about if you have too much stuff going on in relation to unrelated business income tax, you can lose your tax exempt status. So when we look at unrelated business income tax, UBIT, I'm going to call it, that's a UBIT, the first question is the property that you're renting out debt-financed property that had acquisition indebtedness at any time during the year? And you're like, what's that mean? Well, we're going to talk about that. So debt-financed property is property that had acquisition indebtedness, which is, did you borrow money to buy the property or to improve the property? So first you look at, do you have debt? You know, do you have a mortgage on your property? And was that mortgage incurred to buy or improve the property? If the answer is yes, you have a potential for UBIT. If the answer is no, you're done. You don't have UBIT. So rents are only taxable if you have debt-financed property. They're only taxable for UBIT purposes. Let me be clear on that. So we have to take each of those taxes separately. So for example, if a church property was purchased for $1 million and there was $800,000 of debt to acquire the property, and then a few years later you start renting out the property when there's $750,000 of acquisition indebtedness. In other words, you didn't borrow money for operations or anything, it's all the same debt. That property is debt-financed property, okay? So situations when there is no UBIT is property's not debt-financed. If you own your property free and clear and have for at least a year, you can rent your property out without UBIT. So there's another exception. There's a lot of exceptions to UBIT. So even if the property is debt financed, but the rental use or the non-rental use by the church is at least 85% of the total usage, including the rental usage, then you are fine. So this is the 85-15 rule. So if I'm renting out 10% of my property based on how the church uses it and how my tenant uses it, then I'm at 10%. That's below that means the church is using it 90%. So if the rental is minimal, basically, and even though it's debt financed, it will be exempt from UBIT, okay? So the example here is the church uses it 90 hours per week and the tenant uses it 10 hours per week. There's no UBIT, even if there's debt. So now we got two exceptions to UBIT. So there's some examples here, and I'm not going to go through the math, but what you basically have to look at is the hours per week that times the square footage that the church uses, and the hours per week times the square footage that the tenant uses, and you do a mathematical calculation to see if you're at or below 85%. If the church is using it more than 85%, then you don't have tax, you don't have UBIT. So if UBIT is required, for example, if you're renting out your entire campus to a Montessori school during the week, you're going to mess up that 85-15 rule for sure. So when we go to calculate the tax, it's the rental income less an allocation of expenses, so utilities, maintenance, janitorial supplies, insurance, depreciation, and some of you don't have depreciation on your books, but anyway, so you take the rental income minus the allocation of expenses, gets you your net rental income. And then you apply your debt ratio. So if your debt is 60% of the cost of your property, you take that net rental income times 60%, and then you will pay taxes on that bottom line, 21% federal and 4.9 Arizona. So a total of 25.9%. Many rentals result in a loss. So we'll do all these calculations. It'll be a loss. Not always. I have churches who pay UBIT every single year because they've got some good commercial tenants, particularly the churches that are in the strip malls. So they might own the strip mall, maybe 50% of it's used by the church, 50% is rented out. Those folks likely will have UBIT. UBIT is reported on a 990T form or an Arizona 99, and it's due 4.5 months after your year end. And it is not do it yourself. Okay, my accountants in the room who do these returns, they look deceptively simple, but you're not seeing the massive Excel spreadsheets to get to those deceptively simple numbers. So it's not do it yourself. And if your Arizona tax is more than $5,000, it's pretty rare that this happens, but it can. Like if you were to sell property and report a capital gain, it might be. You can actually give that money to an STO, a student tuition organization, to help Christian education instead of paying the state. So if for some reason you think you would have a big chunk of UBIT, you would want to look at doing the corporate income tax credit. And Brett in the back here is with AZTO. He can help you with that. But that's just an option that's available. Okay, so the other issue is property taxes. So we talked about UBIT, which you may or may not have, depending on your circumstances. Now, property taxes. So renting of property can cause your property to be partially taxable, at least partially taxable. There is no hard and fast rule for the counties in Arizona, but small amounts of rent will not cause the property to be taxable. Right now, our county assessor here in Maricopa is the most church-friendly department that I have ever seen in all my history of doing Arizona property taxes. They are very church-friendly. That is not the case in other counties. I've dealt with some other counties where they make you appear in person, and yeah, they're not as church-friendly. So you just want to, I can't give you a percent. I can't tell you, but you're required to disclose any leases on your application for property taxes that you file every year. Now, in Maricopa County, they're actually granting a lot more permanent exemptions. Okay, this doesn't excuse you if you have a new lease. Like, say you start leasing your property to a school. You are required to disclose that even if you have permanent exemption. Okay, how many of you are filing annual property tax exemptions? Okay, not too many, a few. I know we do a number of them in our office, but it's really important that if you do have a lease, that you let the assessor know. You don't want them to find it on their own, and they do look at things like driving by, and they look at the multiple listing services or offers for rent. So be sure that that you look at that. And and especially in the other counties in Arizona. So rental to another church must be reported but there is an exemption for that. So in the ARS is the Arizona Revised Statutes. So if you rent to another church, you're supposed to report it, but then you disclose that it's exempt under ARS 42, whatever. Okay? So rental to a nonprofit charter school. Notice it says nonprofit, not for-profit charter school. Must be reported, but it is also exempt. So you can rent to a nonprofit charter school and have exemption. And other rentals that are significant, we don't know what that means, but 8515, it might mean 2% in another county, might mean 30% in Maricopa. I don't know. It's not in the statute. Must be reported and, excuse me, can result in partial taxation of the property in the ratio to your rental. So if you're the strip mall church and you're renting out 50% of it to commercial businesses, that 50% is going to be taxed. Okay? If you're a church and you're renting out parts of it, you know, if it's a small amount of rental, then it's probably not going to create any property tax issues. But again, there's no published amount. Okay, so transaction privilege tax or sales tax. Here in Arizona, it's called TPT, transaction privilege tax, and the rate's dependent on the city, and it's taxable under the commercial leasing. And they say if you have one property that you lease, you are in the business of leasing. The rate is dependent on the city. So in Phoenix, 2.9, it could be more or less somewhere else. Leases to other churches are exempt. So if you lease your property to another church, and it could be a synagogue or a temple, you know, if it's a lease for religious worship. And taxable income includes virtually all the charges that you charge somebody. So it's CAM, it's, you know, if they pay your property taxes, it's taxable. The category for rental income is not just the rent you get. In fact, Tempe, I know, taxes the fair market value of it. It doesn't even matter how much money you got. So I ran into that with one of my clients. So if you charge cleaning fees, common area costs, property tax reimbursements, improvements paid by the tenant, the list is pretty long as to what's included. So general examples that we see commonly in churches is we look at the cell tower. Because this is probably the biggest amount of money churches. How many churches here get cell tower rentals? Okay, fairly good. So generally there's going to be no UBIT because the footprint of a cell tower is so small compared to the church property. So when you look at the use of the property, that footprint of that cell tower is tiny. For the same reason, it's probably going to have no consequences to your property tax unless you have other rentals. In and of itself, it's not going to adjust your property taxes because, again, we got 14 acres here, and if I'm using a 20 by 20 spot for the cell tower, it doesn't matter. That's minor. So rent to another church, there will be no UBIT because it's generally going to be related. You know, you're renting to another Christian church. Now, the question is if you're renting to a Jewish synagogue, do you have issues that we would need to look at? But in general, a rent to another church. So there would be no UBIT. You have to report it for property tax, but it's not going to be taxable. And there's no TPT on the transaction privilege tax on rental to another church. So if we rent to a private preschool, like a Montessori school, you might have UBIT if the usage is high enough. It will have an effect on the property taxes, and it's generally going to be subject to TPT. We don't worry about program rents. So if you, like my church is leasing to me to put this program on. It's related to church work, clearly, and we're just not going to worry about that. If you have an AA group that meets on your campus, that's part of your outreach and your mission. And typically, they just make a donation anyway. So program rents, like for weddings or funerals, that kind of thing, those you do not need to consider as those are part of your program. Okay? So I sometimes see facility use fees where whoever's using the facility is going to make a donation. Okay, that doesn't get you out of anything. It's rent. So I don't want, we don't want to see facility use fees with a donation, unless you're truly just going to accept a free will donation for your facility, which is not a good idea if the person leasing it is for profit. So you need to make sure that you're getting fair value for for-profit rentals. If you have excessive unrelated business activities, and Jonathan talked about this, if it's excessive to the size of your church, you can lose your tax-exempt status. That's not just measured in dollars. It can be measured by the efforts of staff or volunteers. I've only had one organization where this really concerned me. It wasn't a church, but at one point it was a ministry, and then it morphed into retail stores. And that did concern me, because that's all they did was retail stores. So facts and circumstances tests will apply. This is facts and circumstances means you have to look at all the facts and what the circumstances are, and then compare it to other court cases and that type of thing to determine whether it's going to be taxable. How many hold your worship services in leased facilities? Is there anybody here that leases like a school, or you lease something else for your worship facilities? Okay, we've got a few. So the landlord and the church can jointly apply for a property tax exemption on that building, and as long as it's passed on to the church. So if you're leasing, a public school, this isn't going to matter. But if you're leasing space in a strip mall, then you can actually apply to have the property taxes on that piece rebated back to you. So it requires the cooperation of the landlord and the church. We have a few of those, we do. And be sure you're not paying sales tax on rents for religious worship. So look at your invoices, make sure, because there is an exemption for that. So, and it doesn't have to be a church doing leasing to another church. It's just an overall exemption. Okay, any questions on rentals? Those of you who emailed me, I hope you got the answers you need, and if you don't, you can email me more. But those are the concerns that you need to. Okay, so next up we have Barb Starley, and Barb is going to help you prevent messy books. And I'm all about that. Thank you, Barb. Let me get your microphone. Before I hang up here, I would like everybody to give a big hand to our AV person who's running sound in some of the slides, Jen. And Chris Lamont, who is the master of web streaming. I tell you, with these two people at the helm, I did not worry about this event. And AV is always my worry. It always is. So I just want to thank them for their professionalism and keeping us all on track here. Thank you.
All right, hello everybody. I am excited to give you some information. I have been doing primarily QuickBooks setup, training, and troubleshooting for over 30 years now. And I spend my days talking to people that have either made a mess of their books or inherited a mess, or they're not quite sure why their books are a mess, but they're calling me and asking for help. And so this session is really on the common missteps that create messy books. And if some of these sound familiar, maybe we should talk. I'm also the founder of the Good Steward Church Academy, membership organization where I train bookkeepers, pastors, and treasurers to honor God with their church finances. And to me, that means doing it with integrity. It means that you have confidence in your numbers, and it means that you're giving your leadership team the numbers that they need to make wise decisions. So that's what I'm all about. And so messy books don't help that. So we're going to figure out how to not do that. All right. So the first thing is that there are basically 3 lists of names in any accounting program, and those are your customer, you might call them a donor, your vendor, and your employee. And so your customer or your donor are the monies that come into you, right, as revenue. Vendors are the people that you pay, either individuals or businesses, and employees are the people that you pay and you take out taxes, with the exception of Social Security and Medicare on pastors, of course. But here's what happens. We'll have a donor that sends you money as an offering, and then the check bounces. It's NSF, right? And so all of a sudden, the person in the bookkeeping department says, well, now they're a vendor because I've actually given them the money back. No, they're still a donor, and you need to reduce the amount that you're going to report to them as given as a donation. The flip side to that is I see vendors that you go out and you go to your, let's say, Staples, and you buy printer cartridges, and then you realize when you get back to the office that the printer cartridges are the wrong printer cartridge, right? And so you go back to Staples, return it, and Staples says, oh, well, you paid in cash, let's say, or you paid with a check, and they give you money back. And all of a sudden, you have the bookkeeper that says, oh, well, I have money in, and I'm going to put this in as a deposit. I'll create them as a customer. No, they're still a vendor. You just need to reduce the amount of the expense. But I see this all the time, where there's this mishmash of things. Employees are another whole issue, because a lot of times what I see is that churches just have this one line that they reimburse their employees for expenses, and they have an account actually called reimbursements. That doesn't tell you anything, right? It's kind of like saying miscellaneous. What department is it for? Was it the youth pastor? Was it the women's ministry? Was it children's ministry? Was it cheeses for the nursery? Right? We need to know that stuff. Reimbursements don't tell us anything. So sometimes you're going to have one person that falls into all 3 of those lists. Actually, in churches, it's very common, right? You have people that are attending church, they are donors. You also have them set up, they're also employees. And sometimes you have to reimburse them, and they need to be set up as a vendor. So be careful about which list you're using when you are recording things. Okay, another area that I see probably more than anything is dates. Dates matter in your accounting program, right? We need to be very careful about making sure that dates are correct. This is particularly important at the end of the year when you start getting donations. Just because somebody dates their check December 31, if you don't receive it, or it hasn't been constructively received, which means it was postmarked by December 31. If you don't receive it until even January 3rd, if it was not postmarked by December 31, it is not a December 31 donation. We have to be really careful about that. We need to be above reproach in that area, and we need to make sure that our donors understand what your cutoff is if you are going to accept money like in a mailbox or something like that. So we don't want somebody saying, well, I just dropped it off in the mailbox or slid it under the door, and you don't really know if that really happened. So be really careful about that. This is the typical workflow, and I mention this because how many of you, by the way, are using either QuickBooks Desktop, or QuickBooks Online? How many of you are using that? A lot of people, right? It is a very powerful software, and if it's set up right, I will tell you that if it's set up right, it can be extremely powerful for churches. I have a whole methodology on what I call my fund buckets methodology for handling designated and restricted funds, and it is a great program. But I just kind of want to go through this typical transaction flow. How many of you that raise your hands with QuickBooks are using the online version? Okay, yeah. So I will tell you, a few years ago, I was like, please don't go to the online version. It wasn't robust enough. I felt like we couldn't get the reports out that we needed. But today is a different story. And Intuit is doing everything to make sure that you are moving to the cloud, and they are making the program better. So I'm really excited, actually, about what is happening with the QuickBooks Online Edition, but you need to know the kind of the pros and cons to some of the things that we do. So a typical flow for transactions is we connect our bank or our credit card. If you have not connected your bank because you're like, I don't know if this is secure, I don't to do some of the things that Monica talked about, or Monica's team talked about, that, how are you going to know that you're missing receipts unless you know that the charge came in? And if you wait until the statement comes in, you're talking about weeks, maybe, that you're waiting for a receipt. So if you don't do anything else, at least connect your credit card. That's a great place to start to really understand it. What the transactions do is they go into a holding tank. This is, I think, what scares people, is they think, oh, it's just going to automatically put all my transactions in. That's not exactly how it happens. It goes into a holding tank, and you get to decide what you're going to do with it. You get to categorize it. It goes to the right department. It goes to the right account. And then, if you've stayed ahead of the download, QuickBooks actually goes to work to try to find that transaction and match it. So it makes it really easy to stay ahead of the download. And honestly, what you should be doing is pretty much just matching the things that come through, and have very few things that you have to actually add. So I always recommend that you stay ahead of the download. And then once you either categorize and add, or you match it to something that you've already entered, it's going to move to the register. So that's kind of your typical workflow. What I will say, though, is that artificial intelligence is not really always that intelligent, right? So we have, a lot of times what happens in QuickBooks is, and this may happen in other programs as well, is that the transaction comes in, and we think that, we think that QuickBooks, or whatever program you're using, is, the do-all, end-all, and it's going to figure out where this thing goes. And so I'll have people come and they go, I don't know. QuickBooks said it was supposed to go to inventory, but I don't even have inventory. Well, you're the one responsible for the holding tank, so you need to look at that, open it up, and decide where things should go. So just be really careful about just accepting what QuickBooks suggests, because it doesn't know. We need to teach it, and we can teach it, but especially in a church where you've gone to Costco one day and it was all the youth minister that and the youth department charge, and that's how you categorize it. But the next time somebody goes to Costco, there's 6 different departments that were on this ticket, right? And it needs to be split. So we can't just let your program decide, well, just because I did it last time this way, it's going to be the same for everything. By the way, this is, if any of you use an outside consulting firm, a lot of times that's what they do. They actually write it in their contract that if they see an Amazon charge, they're automatically going to post it to office supplies, for example. That's scary. They need a receipt, and they're the ones that are going to need to know how to categorize it, and yet, because they don't want to invest that much time, they will just say, this is what we do with it. That's a little scary to me. So I would just be careful. I think there is a place for having an outside bookkeeping firm help you, but there is nobody like the person that's internal, that understands the church, that understands the people, that knows what department these people are in, that would do a better job than someone that is trained well and the file is set up well. I will just say that. I've been saying that for 32 years. The best person is somebody internal. Here's something, though, that we need to be aware of. In QuickBooks, there is this thing called an auto-add feature. And the auto-add feature literally says, I'm going to connect the transaction, but I'm just going to skip over the holding tank, and I'm going to skip over the add and match thing, and I'm going to take it right to the move to register. This is what people were so afraid of when they wanted to when they didn't want to get into the cloud. And yet, I see clients that set up a whole boatload of their transactions on an auto-add basis. And so that literally is what happens. They never see the transaction. And what happens is usually get 2 transactions. One, because you put it in, right? Because you're ahead of the download. You know this check is going to come through, and then you put the check in, and then it comes through the bank. And for whatever reason, you said, hey, if it sees this particular thing, debits are really probably the main thing that happens. If I see this particular name, it's going to automatically go here. I just had this situation the other day. I had a client that the same company, the same utility company, invoiced them for electricity and gas. And so she said, every time I see this name, every time QuickBooks would see this name, it's going to go automatically to utilities. The problem was she budgeted for electricity and gas separately. So she's like, well, I don't have any electricity and gas, but I know I paid these bills. And sure enough, we looked and we saw that she had this auto add feature. Everything went to the header. Nothing was split for 9 months. And so there were 18 transactions that now had to go back and get changed into the appropriate sub-account so that it would match up to the budget. This is a common thing, and I really don't like auto add. So I will just say, rules are great. Yeah, let's train our system that, hey, when we have a particular expense, that we want it to go most of the time to this, but don't auto add it. Always just take that one last step and say, yes, that is correct, or no, in this case, that needed to go to gas, okay? This is another issue that comes up that creates duplicate transactions, are recurring transactions. In a lot of systems, you can set up recurring transactions, but they sometimes will cause duplicates. So what will happen is you'll set up a recurring transaction. You say this is going to happen on, let's say, the 1st of the month, but because of the weekend, the bank changes the payment date, and it ends up being paid, let's say, 2 days early. Now, you see it come into the holding tank, you go, oh, yeah, that's that particular expense. You categorize it, and it goes through, and then the recurring transaction goes through also, and now you have 2. So that's a really common thing. So my preference is just use the holding tank the way that it's intended, and use very few recurring transactions now. In QuickBooks Desktop, this was a big time saver. And I did like it in QuickBooks Desktop because the bank fees were so clunky. But in QuickBooks Online, it really isn't necessary in most cases. The other thing is using our special input screens as intended. So in QuickBooks Desktop, you either had a check, which is a one-step method of entering expenses, or a bill pay bill option. And that's a two-step method of entering an expense. And I would say most people will use the one-step method. I have some clients that even if they use their credit card, they'll go in and they'll put the bill in, and then they'll go in and they say, well, we paid the bill with a credit card. That is a lot of extra work. You do not need to do that. So if you are doing that, you're going to save yourself a whole boatload of time by using the expense, if it is a credit card charge or a debit, and then use the check as it's intended, and those are like real physical checks that are going to go through the bank. Okay, so that's a new feature, and I love the fact that we can split that, because now I can print a list of all of just my checks, and they're not muddled with all my debit transactions. Transfers are another thing that I see happen where if you use the screen, QuickBooks knows if you transferred it from the checking to the savings, it knows the debits and credits. But if you don't use that, this is what I usually see happen. Oh, I need to record that I wrote a check to the church. They write a check to the church from the checking account, and then they go and they make a deposit into the savings account. And then they go, oh, but now I have to record my deposit in the savings account, and I got that from the checking account. And literally, they just offset the other entry, and now they have they basically zeroed out their entry. So using the transfer feature is a great thing. And then paying down your credit card, this is especially great for if you do partial payments. So one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is that you are downloading your credit card charges, putting them in the right month, not waiting for the statement, and then paying down the credit card. I think that's really important. One last thing is just heed the warnings. QuickBooks is trying, and your program, if you don't use QuickBooks, QuickBooks is trying to help you not make a mistake. So if they tell you, don't do this, probably a good idea to just stop a second and see if there's another way to go around that. I will say, though, one of the things that comes up is you'll go back in and you'll say, oh, that should have been categorized somewhere else, and you'll get the warning that says, this has already been reconciled. And I'm like, as long as you don't change the amount, it's really okay to change the category. So I will say that. So that's one area. Consistency, though, is key. Consistency is the key to everything, making sure that you have a process, a procedure, and you really understand how things need to flow through the system to get the kind of reports that are going to give your leadership team the right information. I have my table over in the corner. Good Store Church, can meet me over there. I'd love to meet you.
I don't know if you heard all the woo-hoos from the back and from my staff about quick mess, as we like to call it. So love QuickBooks, but gosh, get help setting it up and then get some training, because there's 1,000 ways to go wrong, and we've seen every single one of them. Okay, we are running out of time, so if I could have my vendors line up over here and bring their drawing baskets, and then we'll draw for prizes. I am not going to cover volunteers. Please read through that, and because we had a question on how to compensate volunteers and what to do, so you'll want to read that. Pastor discretionary funds, we did not cover. The moral of the story is you still need receipts, and it can't benefit the pastor. Okay? That's the subject. FinCEN reporting, I have seen churches paying people to do their beneficial owner interest reports. 501c3s are exempt from that. And so, you know, you get scammy emails threatening you to go to jail if you don't do the BOI report. And the moral of the story is you're not required to do the BOI report. So just take that as you wish. And then, so some of you have applied for employee retention credits. And how many are still waiting for refunds? Yeah. I've seen one come through within the last 2 months, but they are now processing. Those will be processed. If you filed an employee retention or for an employee retention credit and you should not have, there is a process for removing your application. And remember that churches were never shut down in Arizona. So if you did not have a decrease in revenues equal to the rules for the church, for churches, then you probably did not qualify. So if you feel like you did not qualify for the employee retention credit, you can pull your application. You can still apply for 2021. So if you were one of those who did not apply and you meet the criteria, you can still apply for 2021. You cannot apply for 2020. Okay, and I think if you take nothing else away, ask for help when you need it, okay? If you have legal issues, if you have property tax issues, if you have new programs like the DES grants, the PPP, the ERC, get help before it gets too bad. Remember to read your balance sheet. Your balance sheet matters. Okay, I have too many clients who never look at the balance sheet. They look at the profit and loss, they give it to their board, and I look at it and I go, what? So your profit and loss cannot be right if your balance sheet is wrong in most cases. So remember to do that. Everyone here should check the Maricopa County Assessor's site, or the Treasurer's site actually, to see if you have a property tax bill. We had a church that got bills, except it got mailed to a wrong address, and 4 years later, somebody had a lien on their property. So I do recommend that you check your property tax records and make sure that you don't have an outstanding property tax bill because errors get made, mailing addresses are wrong, check your mailing addresses too. So this church ended up having to pay $50-some thousand in interest because their property was sold on a lien. And they didn't even know they had a property tax issue. So check your county's treasurer site and see if you have any bills out there. So stay informed and come back next year. And now we'll have all our vendors come up and they'll talk and we'll do a drawing. So I will go first, and you all know what you get from me, don't you? You get the 2024 Church and Clergy Tax Guide, which is a wealth of information. So I will draw first. Mike Darris. Yay, Mike. I love this guide because it's like $50 and it's written in plain language with lots of examples from both a tax and accounting standpoint, so and a legal standpoint. So I love that guide. It's a great one. Thank you. And then we'll have our centerpiece drawing here. Don Kennedy. Is Don here? Okay. You can introduce yourself and then what you're giving away.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is David Campbell. I'm here with Brown & Brown Insurance. I'll make it fast in the interest of time, but wanted to say thank you so much to everybody for stopping by our table. It's always so fun to catch up with you all and learn more about your ministry, your church, your school, everything you have going on. So we have a $75 Amazon gift card.
Ooh. Mary Rodarty. Okay. Yeah, we'll have to get the hands worked out here. Hi, Jonathan.
My name is Jonathan Norton. I'm with the team here at Lightwell. And today we have a camper mug for you. But more importantly, inside of that camper mug is a $100 gift card to Sprouts.
Whoa. Okay, David Estru, senior pastor. You don't look like David. Thank you. That was very generous. Brett?
I'm Brett Rohr with Church Loan Consulting and Arizona Tuition Organization, and I have a $50 gift card from Sprouts because it was on the way over here.
And there's not much on the way over here.
Exactly.
Mary Rodarty. Oh my gosh. See if you ever miss this seminar again. Bob?
Thank you. The winner of this one gets a choice. You can choose one free lawsuit against any person of your choice, or a $50 gift certificate from Visa.
There you go. Tiffany Hand from Wickenburg. Is Tiffany here? Yeah. I'd take the lawsuit. Okay, Heidi.
Hello, I'm Heidi Zinn from the Church Network, and if you haven't stopped by to chat with us, we're back in the corner by the coffee bar. It's a national organization whose slogan is "Don't Go It Alone." It's a group of church business administrators, like all of us, doing all the things with all the hats. So there's a national organization, and then there is a local chapter, so we have more information back there.
Okay, and the winner is Natalie Jones. Natalie here? Okay. This is Luke.
Yeah, Luke Ziegenmeyer with 5 Star Bank. Big thank you to Bob and Monica for the invite. Great to meet a lot of you. And this is for $50 to Starbucks, which somebody who walked by said that's only 2 visits to Starbucks these days.
Alicia Tovar. She's here. Okay, Barb.
I actually have two. One is a $25 gift card. Well, actually, they're both the same. $25 gift card and a Dove candies. And so
we shall see who our winner is. Julie Gertis. Julie here? Yeah. Okay, I'll put that back in. I don't want to draw the same person. And Lydia Perma.
I love purple because I think it's the color of royalty, and after all,
there you go, purple gift card, purple bags, whatever. Yeah, there you go. Okay, if anybody oh, my name tag fell in my cup. Isn't that just appropriate? Okay, everybody, we want to thank you for coming. Please take a snack for on the road home. If there's anything left here, if you want to talk to our vendors, they'll be here for a little bit. You can stop by the coffee shop if you need anything. And let's give the coffee shop a big hand. This was the best coffee we've ever had. Okay, thank you very much.